I never thought I would end up in the middle of the woods alone, in a cabin that was barely standing, with nothing but my own thoughts to keep me company. I had planned this trip for months, telling myself it would be a simple retreat. Just me, the forest, and a chance to escape the constant noise of the city. I wanted solitude, peace, and maybe a little adventure. I imagined mornings with the sunlight streaming through tall pines, evenings with a fire crackling, and nights spent staring at the stars through the thin layer of glass in the cabin windows. I didn't anticipate the way the isolation would start to gnaw at me, nor did I anticipate how small and fragile I would feel when I realized just how unprepared I was for the real, raw wilderness. The drive out had been long and monotonous. My car rattled along a dirt road that grew narrower and more overgrown with every mile. At first, the forest seemed almost welcoming. Birds called from the treetops. A stream crossed the road and sparkled in the late afternoon sun, and the smell of pine hung heavy and clean in the air. I parked where the road ended, under a tree that had bent toward the ground as though to block the path entirely. Beyond it, the cabin stood in a small clearing. From a distance, it looked abandoned, but still intact enough to shelter me for the weekend. The walls were weathered wood, dark and gray, and the roof sagged slightly in the middle. Windows, though grimy, reflected the forest in patches of broken glass. A chimney rose crookedly, and a thin wisp of smoke curled from it, as though someone or something had been here recently. That smoke made my stomach tighten. I told myself it was probably just a neighbor cabin further down the road, someone tending a fire for warmth or to burn brush. It didn't matter. I wanted to be alone, and this was exactly the cabin I had booked. The first few hours inside felt normal. The air smelled of old wood and faint mildew, and dust motes danced in the beams of sunlight that crept through the windows. I unpacked slowly, laying my supplies on the rough wooden floor. Food, water, a small bag of emergency supplies, and my backpack. The cabin had a small stove, a table with one chair, and a bed in the corner with a thin mattress. I stacked some firewood near the hearth, noting that it was dry enough to burn. I thought about the nights ahead, imagining the warmth of a fire and the sound of the wind through the trees. I even tried to convince myself the isolation would be pleasant, the kind of quiet that filled the spaces inside you that noise had long since crowded out. By nightfall, I had a fire going and the cabin seemed cozy enough. I ate a simple meal and sat close to the warmth, listening to the forest settle around me. Every sound, the rustling of leaves, a branch snapping in the distance, the subtle groan of the cabin itself, felt amplified in the stillness. I convinced myself that the noises were normal, part of being in the wild, part of being away from civilization. Still, as darkness fell, I noticed a pattern in the sounds that unsettled me. They weren't random. It was the repeated crunch of footsteps in the leaves outside, far enough away not to be visible through the windows, but close enough that I could hear the rhythm of each step. At first, I thought it was an animal, a deer perhaps, but the pace was too steady, too deliberate. I kept my fire burning late into the night. I checked the windows constantly, scanning the darkness beyond the glass, but I couldn't see anything. The footsteps stopped when I stayed quiet, and then resumed in bursts. My heart rate picked up, and I realized I hadn't considered the fact that the cabin was completely exposed. There were no fences, no neighbors, no quick escape. If someone wanted to approach unnoticed, there was nothing stopping them. I forced myself to breathe, telling myself it was probably just some hiker or a wild animal wandering through the area. I convinced myself there was nothing to fear, and eventually, exhaustion overtook my vigilance. I fell asleep near the fire, my body tense but my mind tired. Morning brought a false sense of relief. Sunlight streamed through the windows, and the forest seemed almost inviting again. Birds chirped, squirrels darted through the trees, and the cabin looked less ominous in the light. I decided to explore the nearby woods, reminding myself that hiking had been part of the plan. I grabbed my backpack and set off down a narrow path that disappeared into thick pines. The air was crisp, the smell of damp earth and fallen leaves heavy, and the silence of the woods enveloped me. It was peaceful at first, but as I walked deeper, I noticed the same feeling I had at night. I was being watched. Shadows between the trees moved slightly, though no wind rustled the leaves enough to explain it. Every so often, I heard a distant crack, the sound of a branch snapping, but there was no animal to be found. I tried to ignore the unease, telling myself the isolation was making me anxious, that my mind was exaggerating small, normal noises. But then I saw them, footprints in the soft mud near a stream crossing. They were large, human, and recent. I froze, my stomach turning. I had seen hikers before, but these weren't casual footprints. They were deliberate, heavy, and circling. Whoever had made them had been moving slowly, carefully, as though trying not to leave a trail but failing entirely. My heart pounded. I debated turning back, but I also didn't want to show fear. I retraced my steps cautiously, keeping an eye on the tracks, and returned to the cabin with my body tight and alert. The day passed in a tense haze. Every sound outside the cabin made me flinch. Every shadow beyond the window seemed sinister. I tried to occupy myself, preparing food, cleaning the cabin, stacking firewood, but the sense of being watched never left. I kept glancing out the windows, imagining someone standing in the tree line, waiting for me to let my guard down. I slept little that night, keeping the fire alive and my eyes fixed on the darkened forest beyond. Each sound, snapping twigs, rustling leaves, distant cries, made my pulse spike. On the third day, the real terror began. I had ventured out to fetch water from a nearby stream. It was a small hike, nothing extreme, but when I returned, I noticed something different. The cabin door, which I was certain I had locked, was slightly ajar. My stomach dropped. I stepped inside slowly, scanning every corner. Nothing seemed touched, no obvious signs of intrusion, but my instincts screamed that something had changed. I could feel it in the air, a subtle, unnatural stillness, as though the forest itself was holding its breath. That night, I heard it clearly. Footsteps around the cabin, slow and methodical. Not the random rustling of animals, not the hurried steps of a hiker. These were deliberate, circling the cabin. I stayed low, pressed against the far wall, watching the fire flicker and illuminate the shadows just enough to make me see movement outside. I didn't know what to do. There was no one to call, no road nearby, no phone service. My supplies were limited, my escape options minimal. I realized, for the first time, that I was truly vulnerable, completely alone. The cabin, once a safe retreat, felt like a trap. By morning, I had devised a plan. I collected what food and water I could carry, packed a small bag with essentials, and decided to leave the cabin before anyone, or anything, could confront me directly. I waited until the sun was higher, the forest clearer, and then slipped out the back door, staying low and moving quickly. My route was through dense underbrush, over fallen logs, and across the stream, following the faint trail I had noticed earlier. Every step made a snapping sound in the dry leaves, and I feared it would announce my presence. I kept my pace steady, avoiding open areas, and tried to remember the terrain I had passed the first day. Hours passed in tense silence. I saw no one, but I could feel the presence behind me, even if it was just the forest playing tricks on my mind. Eventually, I came across a wider dirt road, a faint sign of human presence. My heart leapt. I followed the road, hoping it would lead to a main path or perhaps a house. The sunlight was waning, and shadows grew long across the trees. I could see tire tracks in the dirt, signs of vehicles, and finally, a small house appeared through the trees. It was modest, with a porch and smoke curling from the chimney. Relief washed over me. I approached cautiously, and the owner, an older man, came out. I explained nothing, but the look in his eyes and the gesture to follow him inside made me realize I was safe for the moment. He offered me food, water, and a place to rest. I accepted everything, trembling and exhausted. That night, I slept in a real bed, the walls solid and familiar. I could hear the faint hum of civilization beyond the trees, the distant sound of cars, dogs barking, and the wind in a less menacing way. I stayed there for 2 days, too wary to return to the cabin. When I finally returned with another person, I found evidence I had feared. Footprints around the cabin, signs of someone entering and leaving, and a few items slightly moved. I had been planning the trip for months, but the reality of actually being there hit me in waves as soon as I turned off the main road and drove onto the narrow dirt path leading to the cabin. It wasn't just a cabin. It was a small, weathered structure tucked into a remote valley, surrounded by thick pine forest. I had picked it because I wanted to be alone, away from the noise, away from the world that never stopped moving. The GPS signal had started fading about 10 miles before the turnoff, and by the time I parked at a small clearing in front of the cabin, my phone was nearly useless. That alone added a layer of unease I didn't anticipate. The cabin itself was modest. A single room with a loft above, its wooden exterior gray from age, roof sagging slightly in the middle. The windows were small, framed by faded shutters that creaked in the wind. I had arrived in late afternoon, but the shadows of the trees stretched long and threatening across the clearing, turning the familiar shapes of the forest into something strange and alien. My plan was simple: unpack, get settled, make a fire, and spend the night writing and reading, enjoying the solitude I had longed for. But from the moment I stepped out of the car, the silence around me felt heavy, almost suffocating. Not the peaceful quiet of a cabin in the woods, but the kind that presses in, full of anticipation, like the forest itself was waiting for something to happen. Inside, the cabin smelled of old pine, dust, and a faint sour tang of dampness. The floorboards groaned under my weight, each step announcing my presence far more loudly than I expected. The furniture was sparse. A small table, 2 chairs, a bed in the corner, a stove against the wall, and everything looked as though it had been left mid-use, abandoned suddenly. There were jars of canned goods on a shelf, old newspapers stacked by the fireplace, and an oil lamp hanging on the wall. I put my bag down, ran my fingers over the rough wood of the table, and tried to shake off the unease. It was, after all, just a cabin. I was here alone, and there was no reason to be afraid. Yet the feeling of being watched crept up my spine the longer I stayed still, listening to the whisper of wind through the trees outside. I started by exploring the small space. The loft above was accessed by a steep, narrow ladder, and it held only a mattress, a few blankets, and a small trunk. I opened the trunk and found a few old clothes, some shoes, and a tin box filled with matches and candles. I set everything aside, trying to convince myself that the previous occupants had simply left the cabin and used for years. Still, something about the place made me keep the door locked from the inside, a precaution that felt excessive but necessary in the growing tension that had begun to anchor itself in my chest. As the afternoon gave way to evening, I built a fire in the stove. The wood I found stacked outside was dry, but striking the match and hearing the first crackle of flames against the stove felt almost ceremonial, as if I was creating a circle of safety against the outside world. The temperature dropped quickly, and the wind began to push through gaps in the window frames, rattling them softly but persistently. Outside, shadows lengthened across the clearing, and the forest seemed to grow darker, more alive with hidden shapes that my mind wanted to interpret as movement. I tried to read to calm myself, but my eyes kept drifting to the windows, to the darkness beyond. Every snapping branch or rustle of leaves had me jumping slightly, heart racing in anticipation of something I didn't want to imagine. I told myself it was the wind, the forest settling at night, animals moving quietly, but my thoughts refused to settle. Then came the first sound that broke through the forest's normal rhythm. A low, scraping noise, like something dragging along the ground, coming from the tree lean behind the cabin. My breath caught in my throat. I strained my eyes, but the darkness was complete. I grabbed the flashlight from my bag and shone it toward the sound. The beam swept across trees, roots, and brush, but I saw nothing. Nothing moved, nothing changed. And yet, I knew the sound had been real. It wasn't the wind, it wasn't an animal. It was deliberate. I decided to check outside, rationalizing that I needed to see if anything had approached the cabin. I stepped onto the porch, the boards cold and damp under my feet. The forest pressed against the clearing, thick and silent except for the occasional crack of a branch somewhere deeper in the shadows. I walked slowly toward the edge of the clearing, shining the flashlight in arcs, listening carefully. First, there was nothing. Then, a glimpse of movement. A figure, crouched low, barely distinguishable against the darkness, just at the tree lean. My heart jumped, and I froze, the flashlight trembling in my grip. The figure moved again, deliberately staying just beyond reach of the beam. I swallowed hard, realizing I wasn't imagining this. Someone or something was there. I backed toward the porch, trying to control my breathing. My mind raced, calculating the distance to my car, the tools I had inside, any possible way to defend myself. The figure stayed at the edge of the trees, motionless for long stretches, then shifted again, almost like it was testing me, gauging my response. I didn't dare move closer. The cabin felt like my only refuge, the forest now a trap. My hands shook as I fumbled to lock the door behind me, and the sound of the bolt sliding into place echoed unnaturally loud in the small room. I sat down on the edge of the bed, listening, watching the shadows outside the window. Minutes passed, then an hour. The sound outside subsided. I told myself it was just someone lost, a hiker maybe, or a hunter checking the cabin. But the timing, the deliberate silence, the way it had observed me, it didn't feel random. Night fully descended. The forest was a black wall outside the windows, the moon obscured by clouds. I stayed close to the fire, keeping the lamp lit, checking the windows repeatedly. The scraping noise returned, slower this time, moving closer to the cabin. It circled the structure, never stopping long enough to see clearly. The terror I felt was no longer rational. It was instinctual, deep and gripping. I realized then how unprepared I had been for solitude at this level, how vulnerable a single person could be when the forest became a stage for someone else's intentions. My mind wandered through every scenario. A break-in, someone hiding in the woods waiting, the idea of being stalked for hours in the darkness. The fear was exhausting, making every sound sharper, every shadow a threat. I resolved to stay awake through the night. I collected the heaviest object I could find, an old iron poker from the stove, and kept it with me as I patrolled the cabin in small circles, checking the windows and doors every few minutes. The scraping continued intermittently, a slow, deliberate noise that never strayed far, always reminding me I was not alone. Sleep was impossible. I ate nothing, drank water only occasionally, keeping alert, constantly listening, constantly scanning. The tension was a physical weight pressing against my chest, and by 3 a.m., I realized I was exhausted, my body shaking with adrenaline and fear. I made a decision. I would wait for dawn. Morning light would give me safety, distance, and perspective. When the first pale light touched the treetops, I cautiously looked outside. The forest appeared normal, innocent almost, but I noticed signs of someone or something, having been very close. Footprints in the soft earth around the cabin, disturbed brush along the edge of the clearing, faint drag marks leading toward the trees. Relief mixed with lingering anxiety. I wasn't safe yet, but I could finally move with some control. I decided to leave the cabin immediately, packing quickly, taking nothing but essentials. My car was a short drive down the narrow path, but every step felt heavy with the weight of the night's terror. I kept my eyes on the tree lean, aware of the prints, the tracks, the possibility that the figure was still watching. By the time I reached my car, the sun was breaking over the mountains, scattering light across the valley. The forest now seemed ordinary, almost serene, but the marks left behind told a different story. I started the engine, feeling the vibration under my hands as a comforting reminder of normality. Driving back onto the main road, I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting movement at the edge of the forest. Nothing appeared, yet I knew the events of the night would stay with me. The forest had not changed, but I had. I had learned how quickly solitude could turn dangerous, how the quiet could hide a deliberate presence, and how vulnerable anyone could be when cut off from the world. Back in the safety of civilization, the fear began to ebb, replaced by a sense of clarity. I realized the danger had been real, human, and avoidable only by vigilance and preparation. I wrote detailed notes of everything, marking the location, the tracks, the structure of the cabin, and the signs of intrusion. I reported it to local authorities, who confirmed that the area sometimes attracted hunters or vandals who I had been planning the trip for months, carefully mapping out every detail. I had spent long evenings going through topographic maps, reading forums, and checking the weather for the remote stretch of forest where the cabin stood. The cabin was small, isolated, and older than most of the structures I had ever stayed in, but it had a reputation for being well maintained. The owner had sent photos showing a wooden structure nestled in dense pine trees, a narrow dirt path leading up to it, and a small creek running nearby. I wanted solitude more than anything. No distractions, no people, just the quiet of the forest and the sound of the wind through the trees. I wasn't a reckless person. I didn't take risks for the thrill, but I wanted a test of my own patience and self-reliance, something that would take me far away from the noise of the city. The drive up was long, a steady climb from paved roads to gravel, and eventually to rough dirt tracks that were barely wide enough for my car. By the time I reached the final bend in the path, the sun was already low, casting long shadows across the trees. I could see the cabin through the branches, a dark shape with windows reflecting the golden light of late afternoon. It wasn't luxurious by any measure, but it was solid, made of heavy timber with a tin roof. The kind of place that looked like it had endured every winter for decades and would endure many more. I parked the car and got out, stretching my legs. The air smelled sharp and clean, filled with the scent of pine needles and damp earth. I carried my backpack toward the cabin, noting the crunch of my boots on the gravel. The front porch creaked under my weight, the boards warped slightly from years of weather exposure. I went inside, running my fingers along the rough wooden walls, feeling the texture, the small grooves, the knots in the timber. The cabin had a small kitchen area, a sleeping loft above, and a living space with a wood-burning stove. There were no modern electronics except for a single battery-powered lamp on the counter. I liked it immediately. The silence was thick but comforting, and the natural light spilling in from the windows gave the space a golden warmth. I set down my pack, unpacking the essentials first: food, water, a small first aid kit, my camping knife, and the journal I always carried. I filled the small kettle with water from the sink, which had been left with a note suggesting it was safe to drink. I wanted tea, but I also wanted to observe the ritual of it, the slow heating, the rising steam, the scent. I sat on a chair by the window, watching the sun dip lower. The wind began to pick up, whispering through the branches outside. It made a sound I could only describe as moaning, but it wasn't human or unnatural. It was the wind negotiating with the old forest, brushing against trees that had been standing for decades. As night fell, I lit the stove and prepared a simple dinner, moving deliberately, noting every sound in the cabin. The walls groaned faintly, the wood settling. I was alone, truly alone, and it was both exhilarating and unnerving. I made sure to lock the small door that led to the back porch, and I moved furniture slightly to block access points that could be used to hide if someone were to try entering. I didn't think I would have an intruder. This place was so far from civilization, but old habits die hard. I went to bed early, lying on the cot in the loft with my sleeping bag pulled tightly around me. The wind outside had grown stronger, rattling the cabin in small, irregular shudders. I listened carefully, my ears attuned to every creak and rustle. Hours passed, and the quiet pressed against my thoughts. The isolation became a living thing. I could feel it moving around the cabin, not in the sense of a presence, but as a weight. The mind plays tricks in such isolation, I reminded myself, shifting under the heavy blankets, eyes adjusting to the darkness. I could hear something scratching near the back of the cabin. My heart raced. I had left the small trap set near the creek in case of wildlife, and I told myself it was probably a raccoon or a fox. Still, I stayed motionless, listening, feeling the floorboards vibrate faintly under the impact of the wind. The next morning, I woke early, tension still lingering in my chest. I dressed quickly and checked the perimeter. The back door had been nudged slightly, just enough for me to see that something had brushed against it. Nothing was missing, nothing broken, just a faint footprint in the damp soil. I knelt down, examining it. Human, size unknown, but there were no other tracks, no evidence of a lingering presence. I walked around the cabin slowly, eyes scanning the tree line, heart hammering. There was nothing, just the forest. I reminded myself again that fear exaggerates reality, that my mind was alerting me to every small anomaly. I decided to explore the nearby creek, taking a path that wound through thick undergrowth. The creek was shallow, clear, and fast-moving in parts. Stones jutted above the water, moss-covered and slippery. I kept careful steps, enjoying the sound of water and the occasional bird call. But even here, the sense of being watched never left me. Branches cracked behind me, though every time I turned, nothing was there. My pulse increased. I reminded myself, in the forest, everything has a reason, everything has a source. I just needed to find it. Over the next 2 days, I tried to immerse myself in routines, collecting firewood, filling water containers, maintaining the cabin. I built small barriers around the windows just in case and tested my lines of sight from the loft. The forest, I realized, was not quiet. It was meticulous. Every rustle, every snapped twig, every distant animal call was a message. I began to notice patterns, the way the wind shifted, the way the birds reacted to movement. I documented it in my journal. The isolation became a lens through which I could see details I never noticed before. The curvature of the tree trunks, the layering of moss, the subtle difference in bark textures. It was on the third night that the real fear began, not from sound, but from movement. Around 2 a.m., I woke to a strange vibration in the floor, something deliberate, not caused by wind. I held my breath, listening. Footsteps, soft, careful, circling the cabin. I grabbed my knife and flashlight, heart in my throat, but forced myself to stay low. The movement paused near the back door, then retreated toward the woods. My mind raced. Someone had been following me. It wasn't an animal. No bear, no raccoon could walk in such careful, measured steps. The morning was tense. I scouted the area more carefully, looking for signs. Broken branches, footprints, disturbed soil. There was a faint trail leading into the denser forest, not far from the creek. I followed it cautiously, noting every sound, every shadow. The trail ended abruptly, but I saw signs that someone had been using it for some time. An old campsite, burned remnants of wood, footprints long weathered but still discernible. My stomach churned. Someone else had been here, someone who could be dangerous. I reinforced the cabin. I jammed furniture against the doors, blocked windows, and prepared escape routes. I learned to move quietly, noting how sounds traveled in the forest. I stocked extra water, extra food, and planned an emergency route down the mountain road. Every rustle, every crack of a branch was now a signal, a potential threat. I refused to panic, but I also refused to ignore it. The next 2 nights were tense and sleepless. I slept in short bursts, always listening. Once, I thought I saw a figure at the edge of the tree line, but by the time I raised my flashlight, it had disappeared. My anxiety was at its peak, but I also felt a strange clarity, a focus on survival, awareness, and caution that I had never experienced before. I was alert in ways that felt almost unnatural, noticing shadows, sounds, smells, the subtle way the air changed with movement. By the 4th day, I realized I could not stay indefinitely. Supplies were low, and I had to leave before the intruder returned, or before my own nerves failed me. I packed methodically, leaving no trace of my belongings except the footprint of my steps. I left the cabin as I had found it, tidying and cleaning, but I also reinforced my sense of caution. I descended carefully down the path, checking every bend, listening for unusual sounds, ready to react. Hours later, I reached the road. A car passed slowly by, its headlights cutting through the thick morning fog. Relief washed over me. I was no longer alone. Civilization, noise, and safety were minutes away. I drove off slowly, glancing in the rearview mirror at the cabin disappearing behind me in the trees. The experience stayed with me, not as a story of fear alone, but as a lesson in awareness, caution, and respect for the unknown dangers that exist even in the most tranquil-seeming places. I had survived because I trusted my senses, planned ahead, and remained vigilant without panicking. Weeks later, I returned home and wrote down the entire experience in careful detail. I didn't know much about the cabin when I rented it. The listing online had a few blurry pictures, a short description about being secluded, peaceful, surrounded by forest, and a rating that was decent enough to give me a chance. I had been desperate for a break from the city, and the idea of spending a week alone in the woods, away from the constant noise and obligations, sounded perfect. I imagined long walks, reading by the fire, and the quiet so deep that my own thoughts would finally stop bouncing around like ping-pong balls. The pictures didn't reveal much, and the map showed it was a couple of miles down a dirt road with no nearby towns. That was part of the charm, I thought. Seclusion was what I wanted. The drive there was longer than I expected. The roads turned from paved to gravel and eventually to dirt trails that narrowed between tall pine trees. Every turn made me question whether I had taken a wrong route, and the GPS signal dropped in and out, leaving me relying on memory and vague landmarks. I arrived around late afternoon, just as the sun began to dip low. The cabin sat in a small clearing, surrounded by towering pines and a mix of birch and maple trees, their leaves fluttering slightly in the wind. It was an old log cabin, more rustic than cozy, with weathered wood and a thin layer of moss on the roof. The porch sagged slightly on one side, and the steps creaked under my weight when I climbed them. Inside, the cabin smelled like old wood, damp earth, and faint mildew. The air was cooler than outside, and the windows were thick with dust. I set my bags down and began inspecting the space. It was simple. A small kitchen with a propane stove, a sink with a barely working faucet, a table and 2 chairs, a sofa that looked like it had seen better decades, and a small bedroom in the back with a mattress that smelled faintly of smoke. There was a wood-burning stove in the living room and a stack of split firewood near the wall. I immediately felt both relief and unease. The relief was that it looked habitable. The unease was because it was too quiet. There were no sounds of civilization. No cars, no voices, no dogs barking, not even birds. The silence was heavy, almost tactile. I unpacked quickly and decided to light the stove to take the chill out of the room. The first attempt to light the fire failed because the kindling was damp, so I had to rearrange the wood several times, adding newspaper and lighter fluid sparingly. The smell of smoke eventually filled the room, giving a faint sense of warmth. The sun was gone by the time I finished, leaving only the faint glow of the stove and the dim light from my flashlight when I went outside to check the surroundings. I realized how completely isolated I was. The clearing was small, maybe 50 feet in each direction, and the forest rose sharply beyond that. There was no trail, no road visible past the clearing, just trees pressing in on every side. The only sound was the wind through the branches. That first night was strange. I tried reading, but every small creak of the cabin, every gust of wind outside, made me startle. I kept telling myself it was normal, old cabins shift, wind rustles trees, but the feeling in my chest didn't let up. At one point, I thought I heard someone walking outside, crunching leaves or snapping small branches, but when I looked through the windows, nothing moved. I double-checked the locks, even though the cabin had only a simple latch on the door. I lay awake much longer than I expected, listening to my own breathing and the faint noises outside. The next morning, I tried to shake off the tension by going for a walk. I wandered along the dirt road leading away from the cabin, hoping to find a nearby stream or some sign of wildlife. After walking for nearly an hour, I realized that the road led deeper into the forest and eventually looped back to the cabin's clearing without any signs of civilization. The deeper I went, the more I noticed subtle things that unsettled me. Broken branches in patterns that looked almost deliberate, flattened areas in the underbrush as if someone had knelt or sat there recently, and occasional footprints, some small, some larger, that didn't match any shoes I had. I convinced myself it was animals, but the prints sometimes had a shape that didn't make sense for deer or raccoons. By the second day, I felt watched. It wasn't constant, but a shifting sensation that flickered between my awareness and my imagination. I heard noises just at the edge of perception. Branches cracking, distant thumps, rustling leaves. But whenever I turned or shined my flashlight, nothing was there. I stayed in the cabin more, cutting the walk short. I started taking mental notes. Doors locked, windows secured, firewood stacked where it was easy to reach, flashlight and extra batteries near the bed. I even considered keeping a knife or an axe close. The feeling that something could be just outside watching was gnawing at me. On the third night, the sounds escalated. Around midnight, there was a distinct knock on the door. Not a branch falling or a creaking log, but a firm, deliberate knock. My stomach dropped. I froze, listening. No more sounds followed immediately. I stayed still, heart pounding, wondering if it had been real or a product of my nerves. After a few minutes, I worked up the courage to peek through the curtain. Nothing. I waited longer. Still nothing. I tried convincing myself it was an animal hitting the door, maybe a raccoon or a bear, though the sound was too precise, too loud, too human. I didn't sleep much after that. The following day, I decided I needed to get proof that I wasn't imagining things. I took my camera and walked carefully around the perimeter, checking for footprints, disturbances, or anything unusual. I found more footprints leading into the woods, some of them quite large. I followed them carefully for about 100 meters before they disappeared. There was a sense of deliberate movement, like whoever made them had been avoiding leaving obvious trails. My unease deepened. I returned to the cabin, cleaned the lenses, and reviewed the photos. Shadows were odd, shapes seemed off in a few frames, and in one picture, there was a glimpse of something crouching behind a tree far away, just at the edge of visibility. My fingers trembled as I zoomed in. I could almost convince myself it was a rock or a tree root, but the shape had a human-like posture. That night, the knocking returned. Louder, repeated. At first, it was one knock, then another, then a series thump, 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 like someone testing the latch, pacing around the cabin. I grabbed the kitchen knife and hid behind the stove, trying to remain quiet, straining to hear the direction of the noise. The knocking stopped suddenly. Then I heard footsteps retreating into the forest. My heart raced, my hands shook. I considered leaving immediately, but the only vehicle I had was back down the road I hadn't fully memorized, and I didn't know if I could safely navigate in the dark forest. I didn't sleep at all. The fourth day was spent preparing. I barricaded the door with furniture, stacked firewood against the walls near windows, and cleared a small area around the cabin so there was less cover for anyone approaching. I gathered extra supplies, water, food, batteries, and mentally mapped escape routes. The isolation felt absolute, and every small sound made me flinch. At one point, I heard a branch snap extremely close to the window. I rushed to peek and saw nothing. I realized the person, if there was one, could be anywhere, hiding in plain sight among the trees. That night, I was more cautious. I stayed awake until the early hours, listening for movement. The knocking never came, but the footsteps did. Outside, they circled the cabin, moving slowly, deliberately. I didn't sleep until dawn, crouched behind the stove, gripping the knife like a lifeline. By the fifth day, exhaustion was taking a toll. My nerves were frayed, my eyes red, my movements jittery. I decided I couldn't stay any longer. I planned a route back to the main road, hoping to avoid the same patterns of disturbance I had seen before. I packed lightly, taking only essentials and the knife, and waited until first light. The forest looked peaceful in daylight, deceptively calm. The previous night's horrors seemed distant, almost unreal in the sunlight, but I didn't trust it. I left the cabin cautiously, following the dirt road I had memorized. Every sound made me tense. Bird calls, the wind in the trees, the snap of a small branch. I kept imagining someone in the shadows, tracking me. After an hour of walking, the clearing at the cabin was no longer visible, and I reached a fork in the trail. I stopped, trying to remember the directions. Then I noticed it, a set of footprints matching the ones I had followed before, leading onto the main dirt road, heading in the same direction I wanted to go. My heart sank. Someone had been behind me all along, following my movements. I stayed on the opposite side of the road, keeping my distance, trying to stay out of sight. Eventually, after nearly 2 hours of walking along the road, I reached a small cabin I hadn't noticed on the map. Smoke rose from its chimney, and it looked inhabited. I approached cautiously, and a man stepped out. He looked startled but not threatening. I explained my situation quickly. Lost, alone, pursued, and he nodded. I had been driving for hours along a thin, twisting road that cut through dense forest, the kind of road where the only light comes from your own headlights, and the trees seem to press in on you from either side. I had been planning this trip for months, a solo retreat to a small cabin I had rented in the middle of nowhere, away from the chaos of the city and the constant hum of human life. The GPS had lost signal miles ago, and I was left relying on a printed map and vague directions from the cabin's owner. The air in the car smelled faintly of pine and old upholstery, and I could feel my own nerves beginning to prick at me as the road wound deeper into the wilderness. Every so often, a deer would dart across the road, and I had to brake sharply to avoid hitting it, my heart jumping each time. The cabin itself was meant to be isolated, off-grid, and that was exactly what drew me to it. I wanted solitude, quiet, a place where I could read, write, and reflect without interruptions. What I hadn't fully considered was how unrelentingly isolated it actually was. The last few miles of the road were unpaved, riddled with potholes and loose stones. The headlights illuminated the forest floor only in short, flickering bursts as the car bounced along the uneven surface. By the time I spotted the cabin, a wooden structure with faded brown paint and a small porch, I was already tense and on edge. The sun had dipped below the treetops, and darkness had settled over the forest like a heavy blanket. I parked in the small clearing, my car crunching over dead leaves and dry twigs. The cabin seemed almost deserted, but that was the point. The surrounding forest was silent except for the occasional rustle of small animals and the distant cawing of a crow. I unloaded my bag, my hands trembling slightly despite my attempts to calm myself. The keys the owner had given me turned easily in the lock, and the door opened with a creak that sounded louder than it should have in the stillness. Inside, the cabin was small but functional. There was a living area with a worn sofa, a wooden table, and a small wood stove. The kitchen was basic with a sink, a gas stove, and a few shelves of dishes. The bedroom had a narrow bed with a thin mattress and a small dresser. The bathroom was clean but cramped, with a small shower and a sink. Everything smelled faintly of dust and pine, and I set my bag down, trying to convince myself that the unease I felt was just fatigue and the unfamiliarity of the place. I lit a few candles and moved slowly through the cabin, checking the windows and doors. The isolation was both exhilarating and unnerving. There were no sounds of traffic, no hum of electricity, no voices. Even the wind seemed muted, strangled by the dense trees around the clearing. I set about making a small fire in the stove, the first real warmth in the cabin beyond the cold night air. The flames flickered, casting shadows along the walls, and I sat down on the sofa with a blanket over my knees. Hours passed. I read a book, wrote a few notes in my journal, and ate a simple dinner. As the night deepened, I started noticing small things. The sound of the trees outside seemed louder, more deliberate. A branch scraped against the cabin wall, and my pulse quickened. I told myself it was nothing, just the wind, the natural movement of the forest. But then I heard it, a footstep on the porch, slow, deliberate, and heavy. My heart stopped for a moment. I told myself it had to be an animal, maybe a deer or a raccoon, but the sound was too solid, too heavy for any small forest creature. I moved cautiously to the window and peered out. The porch was empty. The forest beyond the clearing seemed calm, but the darkness was deep, almost suffocating. I gripped the edge of the windowsill, my mind racing. Whoever or whatever was out there had stopped as suddenly as it had started. I waited, straining my ears. Silence. I told myself I had imagined it. I went back to the sofa, trying to force calm, but my body refused to relax. Every creak of the cabin, every sigh of the wind through the trees, made me flinch. Hours dragged on and sleep was impossible. I lay on the bed with the blankets pulled tightly around me, staring at the ceiling, listening. Then I heard it again. Footsteps, outside, moving around the cabin. Slow, methodical, circling. I pressed my back against the wall, feeling the wood grain under my fingers, my ears straining to pick out details. The footsteps paused. I held my breath. A scraping sound followed, like something dragging along the porch. Panic rose in my chest. I considered leaving, but the car was parked in the clearing, and the forest seemed to press in, a wall of blackness I could not penetrate. I remembered the small axe I had brought for firewood. Gripping it tightly, I moved toward the door, checking the lock. Everything was still locked, but I knew that meant little if someone had been waiting outside. I crouched near the door, listening. Then silence. A long, oppressive silence that pressed down on me from all directions. I decided I could not stay in one room. I needed to see, to know what was out there. Gripping the axe, I stepped cautiously onto the porch. The night air was cold, carrying the faint scent of damp earth and pine. I shone a flashlight around the clearing. Nothing, no movement. The forest beyond the small clearing seemed endless, a wall of shadows and shapes my mind tried to give form to. I circled the cabin slowly, every step calculated, trying to listen for any sound, any sign that I was not alone. Hours passed like this. I could not sleep, could not sit still. Every noise made me jump. The rustle of leaves, the snap of a twig, the distant cry of an animal. At one point, I thought I saw a figure moving between the trees, but it was gone the moment I focused on it. My mind was fraying, blurring reality with fear. I started rationing my flashlight batteries, worrying that if they died, I would be left in total darkness. The next morning, light came slowly through the thick trees. I felt almost too exhausted to move, but I forced myself outside. The clearing was empty, nothing to suggest anyone had been there. Footprints? None. Scratches on the porch? Nothing that couldn't have come from branches. It was as if the night's terror had been a hallucination, a product of fear and isolation. I stayed outside, clearing my head, breathing in the cold morning air. I decided I had to leave that night. The thought of staying another day, alone with the memory of footsteps circling the cabin, was unbearable. I packed quickly, making sure everything was in the car. Then I stepped outside one last time. The forest seemed calm in the daylight, almost inviting, but I knew what had lurked in the shadows. I took one last look at the cabin, its walls solid, its windows dark, a place that had become both sanctuary and prison. Driving back, the road seemed less threatening. The sun rose higher, filtering through the trees, revealing the twists and turns that had seemed endless in the dark. I drove faster than I should have, adrenaline keeping me awake and alert. The city lights eventually appeared, a glow on the horizon, a promise of safety and human presence. When I pulled into my own driveway, I felt a strange mix of relief and disbelief. The experience had left me raw, exhausted, and hyper-aware of the fragility of safety, the thin line between solitude and danger. Weeks later, I would think about the cabin often. I never returned, never called the owner to ask if anyone had been there before me. I didn't need answers. The memory of that night, the feeling of being watched and utterly alone, was enough. I understood now how isolation could amplify fear, turn ordinary sounds into threats, and make the mind see danger where there might be none. The cabin had been real, the forest had been real, and the terror had been real. But so had my survival. I realized, too, that the ending of that night, the clear morning, and the drive back were important. The fear had not consumed me completely. I had made it through. I had faced something unknown, something I could not name, and I had survived it by staying calm, observing carefully, and trusting my instincts. The memory of that night stayed with me, but it became a story of endurance, of awareness, of the importance of respecting the wild and the unknown. That cabin in the forest, terrifying as it had been, had taught me something I would never forget. That fear is real, but so is courage, and survival is as much about patience and caution as it is about strength. Even now, years later, I sometimes think about returning. Not to relive the fear, but to face it with knowledge, with preparedness, with the awareness that solitude is a double-edged sword. The forest, the cabin, the silence, they are still there, waiting. And I would be ready because I have learned that real terror is not supernatural. It is real, it is tangible, and it comes from the combination of isolation, darkness, and the unknown. But with careful observation, preparation, and courage, it can be faced, endured, and left behind. I remember the first time I drove down that narrow dirt road leading to the cabin like it was yesterday. Even though it had been years, the cabin was tucked away in a thick patch of forest, miles from the nearest town, surrounded by pines and oaks that grew so close together that the sun barely reached the ground. I had rented it for a week, craving a quiet escape from the city, from the constant noise and unrelenting demands of life. I wanted peace, I wanted solitude, and I thought I could handle it. I had been to remote places before, but this was different. This cabin had a reputation for being isolated, for being the kind of place where you could go without seeing another human for days. It was advertised as a perfect getaway, and in that sense, it delivered. I was just not ready for the way isolation can make the mind turn in on itself. The drive up had been uneventful, though the road was rough and full of potholes, lined with tall grass that reached almost to the hood of my car. At times, the branches of trees arched over the road so tightly that it formed a tunnel, a green and brown corridor that smelled sharply of earth and decaying leaves. By the time I reached the small clearing where the cabin stood, the sun was low on the horizon, slanting golden light through the trees. The cabin itself was wooden, aged, but solid. It looked like it had been built decades ago, though well maintained. The windows were clean, the roof intact, and the front porch had 2 old chairs that had seen better days. I parked my car to the side, grabbed my backpack, and took in the view. There was a small stream nearby, a dirt path leading deeper into the forest, and the kind of silence that feels heavy because it is complete. There was no hum of electricity, no distant car engines, no voices, just the wind through the trees and the occasional bird call. I spent that first evening unpacking, lighting the wood stove, and checking the supplies the cabin came with. There was enough food for a few days, basic cooking utensils, and clean bedding. The cabin had been prepared for someone who wanted to live off the grid for a short while. I remember the first night clearly because even though I had expected silence, the depth of it was unsettling. The wind made strange noises as it passed through the branches, scraping against the side of the cabin. Every time a branch hit the roof or window, my mind jumped. I had to force myself to stay calm, to remember that it was just the wind and nothing more. I went to bed earlier than usual, but sleep came in fits and starts, interrupted by the sounds of the forest settling into darkness. The next day, I decided to explore. The forest was dense, and the air smelled of pine and damp earth. I followed a faint trail along the stream, stepping carefully over roots and loose stones. The terrain was uneven, and I had to move slowly. I noticed signs of wildlife, broken branches, animal tracks, and occasional scat. I had read that bears and other large animals lived in this area, but I did not expect to encounter any. Still, the awareness that I was not alone in this forest was a constant undercurrent of tension. By late afternoon, I had wandered about 2 miles from the cabin and decided to turn back. On the return path, I noticed that the light had shifted. The forest now looked darker and more enclosed. Shadows stretched long across the trail, and I had to watch my footing more carefully. I made it back to the cabin before dusk, feeling tired but oddly satisfied with my excursion. The following days settled into a rhythm. I would wake early, cook a simple breakfast, and spend hours either hiking, sitting by the stream, or reading on the porch. There was a strange comfort in the routine, and yet the isolation began to gnaw at me. By the 3rd day, I realized that the constant silence, which had once seemed peaceful, was starting to feel oppressive. I was hyper-aware of every creak in the floor, every rustle of leaves outside. I found myself checking the locks repeatedly, even though I had no reason to think anyone would come near. The sense of being completely alone in a place where no one could hear me if something went wrong was unnerving. On the fourth day, the incident happened. I was deep in the forest, about a mile from the cabin, following an old hunting trail. The path was overgrown and uneven, and I had to use my hands to push aside branches. Suddenly, I heard it, a low growl, far off, but distinct. I froze, my heart jumping. I scanned the area, looking for movement. That's when I saw it. A large, dark shape moving between the trees, far enough away that it had not noticed me yet. It was a bear. My stomach sank. I knew the basic advice. Stay calm, do not run, slowly back away. But fear had a way of paralyzing me. I could feel my hands trembling. The bear paused, sniffed the air, and then started moving closer. I took a careful step back, keeping my eyes on it, trying not to make sudden movements. The next few minutes felt like hours. I backed away, step by careful step, my mind racing through everything I had read about bear encounters. My pulse was loud in my ears, my breath short. I could feel the sweat soaking my shirt. When I finally reached a point where a large tree was between us, I stopped and waited. The bear, after a long moment, moved off the trail, disappearing into the dense underbrush. I did not wait to see if it returned. I ran. I ran faster than I had run in years, stumbling over roots and rocks, branches slapping my face and arms. By the time I reached the cabin, I was shaking, my legs wobbly. I slammed the door behind me and leaned against it, gasping for air. After that day, I realized just how unprepared I had been. I had planned for comfort and solitude, but not for the real dangers of being in such a remote area. I spent the rest of the week on edge. Each sound outside the cabin made me jump. Every shadow looked like it could conceal a threat. I installed extra security measures, barricading the door with a heavy chair, keeping a baseball bat within reach, and creating makeshift alarms using cans and string around the perimeter. I stopped wandering far from the cabin, sticking to the immediate surroundings. I spent hours observing the wildlife from a safe distance, learning to recognize patterns. When the deer would appear, when the crows would circle, when the wind shifted in ways that carried scents differently. The nights were the hardest. Darkness in the forest is absolute. The lack of artificial light means your eyes adjust, but the mind fills the void with imagined threats. One night, I woke to the sound of scratching at the side of the cabin. My heart jumped, and I froze, straining to hear. The scratching continued for a few minutes before stopping abruptly. I dared not look outside. I stayed awake for hours, listening to every shift of wind and movement of branches. Eventually, exhaustion overtook me, and I fell into a fitful sleep, dreams haunted by unseen animals and the endless, oppressive forest. By the end of the week, I had learned a lot about survival, about being acutely aware of the environment, and about the mental toll isolation can take. I realized that the peace I had sought was intertwined with risk and fear, and that the real terror in such places is not supernatural but real, tangible, and immediate. I packed my things early on the last morning, feeling a mix of relief and disappointment. Relief because I would be returning to safety, and disappointment because the forest, in its quiet brutality, had taught me something profound about my own limits. As I drove down the dirt road back toward civilization, the cabin shrinking behind me among the trees, I felt a clarity I had not expected. I had faced real danger and survived, and in doing so, I had gained a cautious respect for the wilderness. The city would never feel the same, the noise, the lights, the constant human presence, but I was glad to return to it. The cabin remained behind me, silent and indifferent, a stark reminder that nature does not bend to human desire, and that isolation, while seductive, comes with a weight that is both physical and mental. Looking back now, years later, I understand that the experience changed me. I learned to prepare, to respect boundaries, to notice details others overlook, and most importantly, to recognize the thin line between adventure and danger. The forest did not need to threaten me with ghosts or legends. It was frightening enough in its pure, raw reality, and I left it with my senses sharper, my mind clearer, and a deep gratitude for the safety of ordinary life, knowing fully that the peace I had once sought in isolation is inseparable from the vigilance it demands. The experience has stayed with me because it was real, because it tested me in ways nothing else could. And when I tell this story to myself in quiet moments, I do not embellish it. I remember every creak, every shadow, every rustle of leaves. I remember the bear on the trail and the racing of my heart. I remember the nights when the darkness seemed infinite. And I remember the relief, the profound relief, of driving back into the world where the greatest threat is rarely survival but the minor, everyday challenges of human life. That week at the cabin taught me that fear is a teacher, patience is a shield, and that real danger is rarely about monsters. It is about respect, preparation. I had been driving all day, following winding mountain roads that seemed to get narrower and rougher the further I went. I had planned this trip carefully, or so I thought. Booked a small cabin in a remote area that promised quiet, isolation, and the kind of escape from city life that I desperately needed. The GPS stopped giving me directions about 10 miles from my destination, the screen blinking with the message, "No signal." I had expected that in a mountainous area, but the sudden lack of guidance made me uneasy. Still, I drove slowly, eyes scanning the road, keeping an ear on the engine, and a finger tapping nervously on the steering wheel. The forest was dense, the trees stretching high, their thick trunks and branches forming a canopy that blocked most of the fading light. Shadows stretched across the road in odd angles as the sun dipped behind the peaks. The air smelled different here, earthy and damp, with a faint hint of pine and decaying leaves. It was quiet in a way that felt almost unnatural. Even the wind, which should have rustled the treetops and carried sounds through the valley, was minimal, making everything feel still and suspended. I had passed only one other car for the last hour. A lone pickup truck, coming the opposite direction, slowed when it saw me, then passed without any signal or acknowledgement. It left me with an uneasy feeling, a slight chill crawling up my spine. I shook it off, telling myself it was just nerves. I had been looking forward to this trip for months, imagining the peace of sitting by a fireplace, reading, maybe hiking a short trail or two, and cooking my own meals without interruption. Eventually, the narrow road widened slightly, gravel crunching beneath my tires as I followed what looked like a driveway. At the end, partially hidden by overgrown bushes and trees, was the cabin. It was a simple structure, wooden, with peeling paint and a small porch. A stack of firewood sat near the entrance, and the windows were dusty, reflecting the last streaks of sunlight. The isolation was striking. There were no other cabins in sight, no trails, no lights, nothing. I parked and got out, stretching my legs and taking in the smell of the forest. The silence was overwhelming. I could hear birds faintly in the distance, a woodpecker tapping somewhere high in the trees, and the occasional rustle of small animals through the underbrush. I carried my bags up the small steps and unlocked the cabin door, the metal key rattling as it turned in the lock. Inside, the smell of old wood and dust greeted me. The air was cool, slightly musty, and the faint smell of old smoke lingered in the corners. The cabin was modest. A small kitchen area was to the right with a tiny stove, a sink, and cupboards that were mostly empty. A table and 2 chairs sat in the middle of the main room. To the left, a narrow living space had a worn sofa, a small coffee table, and a wood stove in the corner. 2 bedrooms were at the back, each with a simple bed and a thin blanket. There was a bathroom with a toilet and shower, but the water had a faintly earthy smell. Overall, it was functional but clearly not maintained regularly. After unpacking, I decided to explore outside before night fell. I walked around the cabin, noting that the forest was thick in all directions. There were no clear paths, no signs of nearby houses or roads, just the occasional animal trail. The ground was uneven, covered with roots, leaves, and patches of mud. I realized how isolated I truly was. My phone had no signal at all, no messages, no internet, nothing. The realization settled in slowly, and I felt a twinge of anxiety. I built a small fire in the stove, using the wood stacked near the cabin. The warmth was comforting as darkness began to fall. Shadows grew long, stretching across the walls in strange patterns. I checked the cabin, making sure doors and windows were locked. Then I settled in for the evening, trying to read a book by the dim light of a small lamp. The forest outside was quiet, but there was an occasional sound that made me tense. A branch breaking, a low rustle, or the distant howl of some animal. As the night deepened, the silence became almost oppressive. The walls of the cabin felt thin, and every sound outside seemed amplified. The wind picked up, making the trees groan and leaves swirl across the porch. I realized I had never truly been alone in such a place. In the city, there are always sounds, people, traffic, the hum of electricity, the distant siren. Here, the world was raw, untouched, and indifferent. I slept fitfully, waking several times to odd sounds. A sharp crack from the woods, footsteps that might have been my imagination, and a sudden thump on the roof that made me sit up with my heart pounding. I told myself it was an animal, probably a raccoon or something larger like a deer. Still, I kept checking the locks, peering into the darkness outside, my mind imagining shapes and movements that weren't really there. The next morning, I tried to shake off the anxiety. I had packed food for 2 days, water and supplies, and I decided to go for a short hike to calm my nerves. I followed a faint trail near the cabin, stepping carefully over roots and rocks, listening to the birds and insects. The forest seemed peaceful in daylight, but the shadows were deep and deceptive. I felt eyes on me at times, though I knew it was only the animals, maybe even just my own mind projecting shapes into the trees. I hiked for an hour, then returned to the cabin, feeling slightly better. I cooked a small meal and spent the afternoon exploring the small area around the cabin. I found a stream nearby, its water clear and cold, the sound soothing. I realized I needed to ration my supplies carefully because there was no store nearby, no way to order anything if I ran out. The reality of isolation was beginning to settle in more fully. That evening, I decided to go outside to watch the sunset. The sky was vibrant, streaked with orange and purple, and for a moment, I felt a sense of calm. But as darkness approached, the forest took on a different character. The shadows became long, and strange noises began. Twigs snapping, branches creaking, and the occasional rustle in the underbrush. I was alone, truly alone, and my mind started to play tricks on me. I imagined someone or something watching from the trees. The hair on my arms stood up, and I moved quickly back to the cabin, locking the doors and windows as before. That night, the noises were worse. Something scratched at the side of the cabin. I couldn't see anything through the small window, but the sound was persistent. It moved along the walls, paused, and then continued. I felt trapped, anxious, and unprepared for whatever could be outside. I stayed near the stove, keeping the fire going, trying to calm myself. I checked every lock again, and then I tried to sleep, though every creak and crack made me startle. In the early hours, I was woken by a loud crash outside. Something heavy had hit the porch or the side of the cabin. My heart was racing, and I realized I had to confront this rationally. I grabbed a flashlight and a long stick I had found outside, preparing to investigate. When I stepped out, the forest was pitch black. The moon had not yet risen, and the beam of my flashlight only penetrated a few feet. I scanned the area carefully and noticed tracks in the soft soil near the cabin. They were large, too large for a small animal, and my pulse quickened. I decided not to stay outside longer than necessary. I walked around, shining the light, and eventually saw a large deer caught in the underbrush. Its antlers had struck the porch as it struggled to free itself, explaining the noises. Relief washed over me, but my body remained tense. I helped it move slightly, making sure it was not injured in a way that would make it dangerous if it returned. Once it disappeared into the trees, I returned inside, exhausted but relieved. The next day, I spent it carefully organizing the cabin, making sure everything was secure. I reinforced the doors, cleared the porch area, and even built a small barrier around the firewood to prevent any further accidental damage. I walked the area again, mapping out potential hazards, animal trails, and safe paths. I realized I needed to respect the isolation and the wildlife, not underestimate them, and prepare for any eventuality. By the third day, I began to settle into a cautious routine. I collected water from the stream, cooked simple meals, maintained the fire, and kept the cabin tidy. The noises from the forest continued, but now they were predictable. Birds at dawn, small animals rustling through leaves, and the occasional distant howl. I still felt a thrill of fear each time I heard something unexpected, but it no longer paralyzed me. I was alert, prepared, and aware, and that awareness gave me a sense of control. On the final night, I prepared for the next morning's departure. I double-checked the cabin, secured the doors, and packed my bags. The fire in the stove was burning low, the cabin warm and safe. I reflected on the experience, realizing that the fear I felt was real, but manageable. The forest, I had been planning this trip for months. The cabin I had rented was deep in the forest, miles away from the nearest town, perched on a slope that overlooked a narrow valley. The GPS signal would disappear almost completely once I left the main road, which was exactly why I wanted it. I wanted solitude, a chance to disconnect from everything: the internet, work, people, and just be alone with the woods. I had been burned out for months, running on the kind of stress that creeps in and doesn't let go. And the idea of spending a week alone, living simply, and hiking the trails around the cabin seemed like the perfect escape. The drive there was long. I left early in the morning before sunrise, so I could reach the cabin while it was still light. The roads were winding and narrow, sometimes reduced to single lanes with steep drop-offs on one side and thick forest walls on the other. My car's headlights cut through the morning fog, illuminating the thin line of pavement ahead, but I could feel the weight of the trees pressing down on me. Everything felt silent in a way that was almost unnatural. There were no birds, no rustling of leaves, just the hum of the engine and the occasional crunch of gravel under the tires. I reached the cabin just after midday. It was smaller than I imagined, but charming in a rugged way. The exterior was dark, weathered wood, almost blending into the forest behind it. A small porch ran along the front, and the windows were dusty and slightly fogged. I carried my backpack, which was heavy with supplies: food, water, firewood, a small first aid kit, a flashlight, extra batteries, and some basic tools. I unlocked the cabin and stepped inside. The smell of old wood and dust filled the air. It was warm, but not uncomfortable. There was a stone fireplace in the corner, a small kitchen area, and a lofted bedroom. The cabin was minimally furnished, but it had what I needed. I unpacked slowly, taking note of everything around me. I checked the doors and windows, making sure they were all secure. Then I stacked the firewood neatly beside the fireplace. I didn't plan to use the fireplace that first day, but I wanted it ready. I wandered around the cabin, examining the structure, the small kitchen, the loft. Everything was solid, functional, though old. I made a mental note that the cabin had probably been here for decades. By late afternoon, I decided to take a short hike to familiarize myself with the trails nearby. The forest around the cabin was dense, the trees tall and tightly packed, their branches forming a sort of green ceiling that filtered the light. The ground was uneven, strewn with roots and fallen branches, and the air smelled of moss and damp earth. I stuck to a marked trail that led down toward a small creek I had seen on the map. The creek was narrow, with water rushing over stones and fallen logs, creating a soft but constant roar. I followed it for a while, appreciating the solitude, the sound of the water, the occasional chirp of a bird or rustle of a small animal. As I hiked back, the sun was beginning to drop behind the trees. Shadows stretched across the path, long and dark. I felt the forest close in, as if the trees themselves were watching. I told myself it was just the light, the quiet, my mind playing tricks. Still, I quickened my pace. When I finally reached the cabin, the sky was fading to orange and purple, the forest darkening rapidly. I locked the door behind me and turned on the small battery-powered lantern I had brought. I made a simple dinner, sitting at the tiny wooden table, and listened to the forest outside. The first night was mostly uneventful, though I had a hard time sleeping. Every small sound, the creak of the cabin, the wind through the trees, the scurrying of small animals outside, made me tense. I kept thinking about the distance from the main road, the fact that no one was nearby. I reminded myself that I was prepared, that I had my supplies and my plan. Eventually, exhaustion overtook anxiety, and I fell into a restless sleep. The next day, I decided to explore a larger trail that led further up the mountain behind the cabin. I packed water, snacks, a map, a compass, and my flashlight in case I stayed out longer than expected. The trail was steep and rugged, climbing sharply through thick underbrush. I moved slowly, carefully placing my feet on stable ground, aware that a misstep could be dangerous. I stopped frequently to catch my breath, drink water, and observe the surroundings. Birds and insects became more abundant the higher I climbed, and the air was cooler and crisper. By late morning, I had reached a plateau that offered a view of the valley below. The forest stretched endlessly in every direction, broken only by occasional clearings or rock outcroppings. I sat for a while, taking in the scenery, eating a granola bar, and filling my water bottle from a small spring I found nearby. The place was breathtaking, almost too perfect, and that's when I noticed the first sign that something was off. A faint trail of footprints led off the main path, heading deeper into a dense patch of trees. They were human footprints, fresh, pressed into the soft earth. I froze. The area was remote. I hadn't seen anyone else since the road hours ago. My mind raced. Who could be out here? Hunters? Another hiker? The footprints were large, and they moved in a deliberate direction, not meandering. Something about the way they disappeared into the dense forest made my stomach tighten. I debated following them, but decided against it. I turned back toward the main trail and started my descent. Every step felt heavier. My senses sharpened. I noticed every snapping twig, every rustle in the bushes, every distant thump or crack. By the time I returned to the cabin, the unease had settled in fully. I locked the door, drew the curtains, and checked the windows again. I didn't see anyone outside, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Over the next day, I tried to shake off the fear. I spent time gathering firewood, tidying the cabin, and exploring closer trails. But the sense of unease never left. I would occasionally spot broken branches or disturbed foliage near the cabin, as if someone had passed through recently. One evening, as I was returning from a short hike, I noticed fresh footprints near the back of the cabin, leading from the edge of the forest to the porch. I froze, staring at them. The prints were unmistakable. Someone had been here while I was out. Panic started to creep in. I didn't know if the person was dangerous, whether they had seen the cabin was occupied, or if they were still nearby. I spent a long time barricading the doors with furniture, stacking firewood against the weakest entry points, making sure the windows were locked and covered. That night, I barely slept. Every sound, the wind rattling the windows, the creak of the cabin, the distant calls of animals, made me jump. I stayed awake for hours, listening, waiting. The following morning, I decided I needed a plan. Couldn't just sit and wait. I packed extra supplies in my backpack, including more water, food, and my first aid kit. I made sure my phone was fully charged, though I had no signal beyond a single bar that came and went. I considered hiking back to the main road, but the path was long, steep, and I didn't want to risk encountering whoever had been near the cabin while I was on the trail. Instead, I spent the day observing, trying to spot any movement in the trees. I didn't see anything, but the footprints persisted. By evening, the tension had reached a peak. I had prepared as best as I could, but I knew someone had been in the area. I decided I would stay alert, keep the cabin secure, and hope for the best. I made a fire in the fireplace, sat close to it, and kept a flashlight and a small hatchet within reach. Every small sound made me flinch. Shadows stretched across the cabin, and the forest outside seemed darker than before. The next day, I woke early and decided to confront the situation. I took the backpack and packed it with essentials, planning to leave the cabin and hike down to the main road. I knew it would be risky, but I couldn't stay there any longer, not with the feeling of being watched. As I prepared, I noticed something strange. A small, abandoned campsite a few hundred feet from the cabin, hidden in the trees. There were remnants of a fire, a few tattered pieces of cloth, and signs that someone had been living there recently. I realized then that it wasn't just a random hiker or passerby. It could have been someone living in the forest, someone unaccustomed to contact but possibly dangerous. I decided to wait until late morning when the light would be better for hiking. I stayed vigilant, constantly checking the forest edges, listening, watching. Around mid-morning, I finally set out, moving quickly but carefully down the main trail toward the road. Every rustle of leaves made my heart race. I kept my hatchet close, flashlight ready, and my senses on high alert. Took hours navigating steep slopes and uneven terrain. I rested only when necessary, always watching. The forest seemed endless, the trees thick and oppressive. Eventually, after what felt like an eternity, I saw the faint outline of the main road through the trees. Relief washed over me. I had always liked solitude, the kind that comes from being far away from anyone who might notice you. I had been driving through the winding back roads of northern Montana for hours, following a map I barely trusted and a gut feeling that told me I was on the right path. The air had a cold bite to it even though it was late August, and the sun had started to fall behind the thick line of pine trees. I remember noticing how quiet it was, the kind of quiet that didn't just stop sound. It made you feel watched, even if no one was there. The road I had been following deteriorated into gravel, and then a narrow trail barely wide enough for a single car. I wondered if the people who lived out here even existed, or if this area was abandoned completely, which only added to the uneasy calm in the back of my head. The cabin came into view almost without warning. From the road, it looked small and weathered, tucked between two tall evergreens with the kind of shadow that made everything seem darker than it actually was. The wood was aged, gray, with patches where water had darkened the planks, and the roof sagged slightly in the middle. A thin trail of smoke curled from the chimney, though I couldn't hear anyone moving. It wasn't much, just enough to make it look like it had been used recently. I parked the car a few yards away on soft dirt and walked toward it, my boots sinking slightly into the ground with every step. The smell of damp pine and wet earth filled the air, mingling with a faint, sharp odor that I couldn't identify at first. The front door was locked with a rusty latch, but it moved easily when I pressed it. The first thing that hit me inside was the smell of old wood and mildew, mixed with the faint metallic tang of rust. Sunlight streamed through the grimy windows, painting uneven rectangles on the wooden floorboards, and I could see dust motes drifting lazily through the beams of light. The room was empty of furniture except for a small table in the corner, a chair that had collapsed long ago, and a wood-burning stove against one wall. The walls had holes in the wood and gaps that looked like they might let animals in if they wanted. My first thought was that I had stumbled across a cabin that had been abandoned for years, maybe even decades. I set my bag down and took stock of the place. The floorboards creaked under my weight, and I made a note to be careful if I moved too quickly. The back door was similar to the front, old but functional. There was a small kitchen area with a sink that had no water and a few cupboards with broken doors. I opened them to find some remnants of food. Cans of beans, bags of flour that had long ago been nibbled by rodents, and a dusty jar with an unidentifiable substance. The more I explored, the more I felt like the cabin had been left in a rush, like someone had just disappeared one day and never returned. I decided to light a fire in the stove. The woodpile outside was small but usable, and the wood smelled dry enough despite the damp air. I stacked the logs carefully and used a small pile of kindling I found in a drawer. As I struck my matches, the smoke started to curl up through the chimney and the heat began to spread slowly through the room. It gave me a small measure of comfort, though I still felt exposed, like I had wandered into someone else's life without permission. The fire gave off a faint crackle and warmth, and I sat on the edge of the collapsed chair, listening to the woods outside, trying to ignore the sense of unease creeping into my chest. I spent the afternoon exploring more thoroughly, checking the corners of the cabin, the small loft above, and even the shed outside. Everything was abandoned, but not in a way that screamed danger. It was quiet, normal abandonment. I felt safer as the sun climbed higher and began to fade behind the mountains, though there was a creeping awareness that I was utterly alone. No birds called, No wind rustled through the trees in more than the faintest whisper, and the dirt road I had driven in on seemed swallowed by the forest behind me. By the time night fell, the air had dropped several degrees in temperature, and the shadows in the cabin deepened, turning every corner into a black void. I had eaten a small meal of canned food and settled near the fire, trying to keep warm. The firelight flickered against the walls, throwing shapes that made me tense at every turn. I had a flashlight and a small knife with me, and I kept both within arm's reach. I felt the first real pangs of fear as I realized that if something went wrong tonight, I was miles from any help. My phone had no signal, the car keys were inside, and I had no way of summoning anyone. Hours passed in the near silence of the forest. Every sound became amplified: the creak of a floorboard, the distant snap of a twig, the flapping of what I assumed was a bird against the roof. At one point, I thought I heard voices, faint and unintelligible, carried by the wind, but I couldn't be sure. My heart would skip beats each time the shadows seemed to move just outside the window. I tried to focus on the fire, letting the warmth and light anchor me to reality. I reminded myself repeatedly that there was no one else here, that the cabin was abandoned, that the forest was quiet and empty. Still, I could not shake the sensation of being watched, of being noticed by someone or something I could not see. Around midnight, I decided to sleep. I cleared some floor space near the fire and laid my sleeping bag down. I had a thin pad, but it offered little comfort on the hard wooden floor. The fire had burned down to embers, giving off just enough heat to keep me from shivering. I tried to ignore the noises outside, the distant rustle of branches, the occasional pop of a falling branch, the soft scuffing that sounded almost like footsteps. Sleep was difficult. I kept my knife under my pillow, my flashlight within reach, and I lay as still as possible, listening to the forest, trying to convince myself that everything was fine. Then came the sound that made me sit upright with my heart in my throat. It was a scraping noise, slow and deliberate, coming from the back of the cabin. Not a branch against the wall, not the wind. It was something heavier, something moving along the outside wall of the cabin. My first thought was that an animal had climbed the wall or was trying to get inside. I stayed very still, breathing slowly, listening. The noise stopped. Then it moved to the front side, near the window. I could hear faint scuffing on the dirt outside, the sound of something pacing. My mind raced through every possibility. Bear, mountain lion, human, and none of them were comforting. I grabbed the flashlight and crept to the door. The light beam cut across the clearing, and my stomach sank. There were footprints in the soft dirt around the cabin, too large for any deer or small animal, and they circled the cabin slowly. Something had been walking around for hours, keeping its distance, watching. I could see the outline of a figure in the moonlight at the edge of the trees, frozen for a moment before vanishing back into the darkness. Panic surged through me, but I forced myself to stay calm. The cabin had one window that faced the road I came in on, and I made the decision to leave. Slowly, carefully, I packed my bag, keeping the flashlight pointed toward the shadows. As I opened the door, the night air hit me sharply. The figure was closer now, or maybe it had been there the whole time. I could not tell. The footsteps in the dirt had stopped. I moved quickly, trying to keep my heart under control, heading toward the car. I had no plan beyond reaching it and driving away. The gravel crunched under my boots as I reached the car. I fumbled with the keys, my hands shaking. Then I saw movement in the corner of my eye, a shadow slipping silently between the trees. I slammed the door shut and locked it, fumbling with the ignition. The car roared to life, and I hit the gas, the tires spinning on the loose dirt before catching grip and throwing me forward. I didn't look back until I had driven several miles, the headlights cutting through the darkness. There was nothing there. The cabin, the figure, all had vanished into the night. The fear still sat heavy in my chest, but I told myself I had survived. I reached a small town hours later, exhausted and trembling, and checked into a motel. I spent the night staring at the door, listening to the hum of electricity and the distant cars, grateful for the mundane noises that signaled life and safety. The next day, curiosity drove me back, though more cautiously. I wanted to know what had been there, When I returned, the cabin looked deserted, completely abandoned. There were no footprints around it, no signs that anyone or anything had been there. The wood had not shifted, the smoke from the chimney was gone, and the forest seemed peaceful. I checked the dirt road, tracing the path I had come, but there was nothing unusual. No evidence of the figure, no tracks, no marks. It was as if the night had played a trick on me, and yet the fear I had felt was real, raw, and unforgettable. I stayed for a while, examining every corner of the cabin in daylight. I found signs of previous human use. Old tools in the shed, broken furniture, remnants of canned food, even a journal buried under debris in the loft. The entries were mundane, notes about fishing trips, the weather, and simple survival, but none mentioned anyone else coming near the cabin. The place had been lived in long ago, left to rot, but there was no hint of the night's terror in the pages. I realized then that whatever had scared me was either human or I never thought a simple weekend in a remote cabin could turn into one of the most terrifying experiences of my life. I had been looking forward to this trip for months, a chance to get away from the constant noise of the city, the emails, the phone calls, the people everywhere. The cabin was advertised online as a rustic, secluded retreat, a place where I could disconnect completely. The pictures were charming. A small wooden structure with a stone chimney, surrounded by dense trees, a narrow path leading to a river in the distance. The reviews were overwhelmingly positive, mostly from people who mentioned peaceful solitude, the sound of the wind through the trees, the crackling of the fireplace at night. It all sounded perfect. I arrived late in the afternoon, the sun just beginning its slow descent, painting the sky in streaks of orange and purple. The drive had been longer than I expected, winding along narrow roads flanked by towering pines, the occasional deer darting across the asphalt. By the time I reached the cabin, the forest was quiet except for the faint rustle of leaves. I parked in front of the cabin, noting the small wooden deck and the old but sturdy railing. The door creaked slightly as I opened it, a sound that felt unnervingly loud in the stillness of the surroundings. The interior was as advertised: simple, cozy, and rustic. There was a small living area with a worn couch and a fireplace, a tiny kitchen with basic utensils, and a loft bedroom above. I set down my bags, unpacking only the essentials, and lit the fireplace, welcoming the warmth and the faint scent of burning wood. Outside, the forest was growing darker by the minute, shadows stretching long across the ground. I had come prepared, bringing food, a first aid kit, extra blankets, a lantern, and a small toolkit. I was not one to take chances, especially in places so remote. The first night passed uneventfully. I ate a simple dinner, read by the fire, and fell asleep in the loft with the window slightly open. The sound of wind through the trees was oddly soothing, though occasionally I thought I heard distant snapping sounds, like branches breaking underfoot. I chalked it up to deer or other wildlife moving about. The isolation was part of the appeal, after all. The next morning, I woke early to the smell of smoke from the fireplace still lingering. I made coffee over the small stove, watching as a thin mist hung over the forest. I decided to explore the surrounding area, curious about the river the listing had mentioned. The trail was narrow and uneven, littered with fallen leaves and pine needles, and the forest seemed denser the further I went. Birds chirped occasionally, but otherwise, there was an eerie silence. I walked for hours, reaching the river just as the sun was high in the sky. The water was clear and fast-moving, tumbling over rocks and small rapids. I sat for a while, dipping my hands in the cold water and taking in the tranquility. On the way back to the cabin, I noticed something strange. A set of footprints in the mud, not too large and irregular, as if the person or animal had been moving quickly. They were human, I realized after a closer look, the soles of sturdy boots visible in the soft ground. My stomach tightened. This was a remote area. I hadn't seen another person since I arrived. I followed the trail for a short distance, but it disappeared among thick undergrowth. I told myself it was probably someone else hiking in the area, maybe staying in a nearby cabin I didn't know about. Still, a faint unease settled in my chest. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, the forest seemed to change. Shadows deepened, and the air grew colder than before. I made dinner and ate quickly, keeping the fire burning high. I checked the locks on the doors and windows, double-checking that everything was secure. It felt silly, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't entirely alone. It wasn't until the second night that the tension escalated. I was lying in the loft, trying to read, when I heard a sound from outside. Something heavy, deliberate, moving along the deck. My heart jumped. I froze, listening. The deck creaked again, closer this time, a slow, dragging sound. I grabbed the flashlight I had kept beside the bed and shone it across the room, then toward the door. Nothing. The forest beyond the cabin was black, impenetrable, but I could see faint shadows against the windows. I convinced myself it was an animal, perhaps a raccoon or a stray dog. Still, I could not shake the feeling that the sound had been human. Sleep came reluctantly, and when it did, I woke multiple times to more sounds. Scratching at the door, a soft thud against the wall, the faintest whisper of movement in the trees outside. Each time, I sat up, flashlight in hand, heart racing, until the sound stopped. I tried to remind myself I was prepared, that I had a phone with emergency numbers stored, that the cabin had good locks. Rational thoughts, but my body refused to calm. The next morning, I ventured outside cautiously. The deck had marks, scuffed and smudged in the dirt, as if someone had been standing there, watching. I took photographs for documentation, trying to rationalize. Maybe it had been hikers passing by, maybe a curious animal that left footprints and knocked against the walls. I told myself the fear was in my mind, amplified by isolation and exhaustion. That afternoon, I decided to hike further than before, needing to burn off nervous energy. I packed water, snacks, and my small survival kit. The trail led into denser forest, steep inclines, and tangled roots. Hours passed. The sun lowered, long shadows stretching across the mossy ground. And then I saw it, a figure in the distance between the trees. At first, I thought it was another hiker, but the way it stood, unnervingly still, made me pause. I froze, staring. It moved slightly, then disappeared behind a tree. My pulse spiked. I considered running back to the cabin, but remembered the terrain. I could lose footing and twist an ankle, leaving myself stranded. I moved cautiously, taking care to make as little noise as possible, scanning constantly. The figure did not reappear, but the feeling of being watched remained. By the time I returned to the cabin, the sun was nearly gone. The forest was a dark wall, shadows merging into night. I checked the locks again, inspected the windows. Everything seemed secure, yet I could not shake the anxiety coiling in my stomach. That night, the sounds returned with a vengeance. Heavy footsteps on the deck, scraping along the siding, rustling in the underbrush. I sat in the living room, flashlight in hand, my back pressed against the wall near the door. I considered calling the police but hesitated. The nearest station was over an hour away, and the cabin was deep in a rural area. Even if they came, they might not reach me in time. I reminded myself that staying calm was crucial. Hours passed, each sound making me flinch. I kept the fire going, moving occasionally to check the windows. Around midnight, I heard the loudest sound yet, the front door handle rattling violently. My heart pounded, sweat soaked my clothes. I grabbed the small hatchet I had brought, standing ready in the dark. The handle rattled again, then stopped. Silence followed, thick and suffocating. I waited, counting every second, until the first signs of dawn lightened the sky. The next morning, I ventured outside and discovered something that made my stomach turn. The door had been forced slightly, the lock damaged. Whoever or whatever had been there had tried to enter. Panic surged, but I forced myself to think logically. I packed everything I could carry: food, water, blankets, and the small toolkit. I decided to leave immediately, walking carefully back to my car along the same narrow trail. Every snap of a branch, every rustle in the leaves made me tense. The walk back was tense but uneventful. When I reached my car, I inspected it carefully before getting inside. The keys were already in the ignition from earlier, and the doors were locked. I started the engine and drove slowly, constantly scanning the tree line. No one followed. The forest remained silent, but the sense of danger lingered in the back of my mind. When I finally reached the main road, the tension began to ebb, replaced by exhaustion and relief. I stopped at a gas station to collect myself, making a few calls to friends to explain what had happened. Later, I reported the incident to the local authorities, who took my statement seriously. They mentioned that in that area, there had been occasional reports of squatters and trespassers targeting isolated cabins, sometimes looking for supplies or shelter, sometimes with more dangerous intent. The days following were difficult. I struggled with sleep, replaying every sound and shadow in my mind. But over time, the fear subsided, replaced by a wary sense of caution. I realized that the experience had taught me the value of preparation, vigilance, and respect for isolation. I also learned that I remember the first time I decided to rent that cabin deep in the woods. It was late September, the kind of crisp, clear air that made the edges of the world feel sharper and colder. I had been working for months straight, buried in paperwork and screens, and I needed something far from human civilization, something that would force me to slow down, breathe, and just exist. The cabin was small, simple, and isolated. The ad had said it sat on the edge of a forest, a good mile from the nearest dirt road, and that alone had drawn me in. I liked the idea of being unreachable, of having no one around for miles and miles. The drive in was longer and rougher than I expected. The paved road ended abruptly, giving way to a narrow path carved into the forest floor. Potholes filled with water from recent rains made the trip slow and careful. I had brought a compact SUV, and even that felt unstable on the uneven, root-cracked dirt. Branches scraped against the sides of the car, small twigs tapping like impatient fingers against the roof. As I drove, I noticed how quiet it was, too quiet in a way that made my ears ache. No birds, no distant dogs barking, no hum of far-off traffic, just the crunching of tires over leaves and small stones. Every so often, a deer or a fox would dart out, freeze for a moment, and then vanish into the shadowed woods. I kept seeing movement out of the corner of my eye, just shadows probably, but it already made my skin prickle. The cabin itself looked smaller than I imagined. It was built from dark logs, weathered by years of rain and wind, and there was a thin stone chimney rising awkwardly from one side. The roof was uneven, and the windows were dirty, some with small cracks running through the panes. A single wooden porch ran across the front, sagging slightly in the middle. Despite its flaws, it had character, a stubborn solidity, like it had survived decades of storms and snow, and I found that oddly comforting. There was a small, neglected path leading from the cabin into the forest, disappearing between thick pine trees, and I immediately guessed it hadn't been used in a while. The air smelled damp, earthy, and slightly of decaying leaves. It was the smell of places humans didn't often tread. I parked, cut the engine, and sat for a moment in silence. My stomach was tight with both anticipation and unease. The silence seemed almost physical, pressing against my chest. I stepped out of the car, the cold air instantly biting my skin. The forest around me was dark even in the late afternoon light. Shadows moved in ways that didn't make sense at first glance, and the wind whispered through the trees like it was trying to tell me something. I shrugged off the feeling, blaming it on being too used to city noise. I grabbed my small suitcase and backpack and walked up to the cabin, the wooden boards creaking under my weight. The interior was small but functional. One main room with a tiny kitchen area against one wall, a wood stove in the corner, a rough wooden table with 2 chairs, and a staircase leading to a lofted bedroom above. The loft had just enough space for a mattress and a few personal items. Everything was covered in a layer of dust, and the air smelled faintly of mildew and old wood. I spent the first hour wiping down surfaces, checking locks, and setting up the bed and small cooking supplies I had brought. I made a simple meal on the stove, a can of beans and some bread, and ate quietly, the only sound the occasional pop of the stove and the hum of the forest outside. As night fell, the forest changed. The shadows deepened and became harder to distinguish from reality. The wind grew stronger, brushing against the cabin walls and rattling the window panes. I sat in the small chair, trying to read a book, but I kept being drawn to the windows, half expecting to see movement. Around 9 o'clock, the forest went completely silent. Even the wind seemed to vanish. I couldn't hear anything beyond the creaking of the cabin itself. That was when I first noticed a small sound outside, almost imperceptible: the crunch of leaves under feet. At first, I told myself it was an animal, a fox or a deer, but the pattern of the sound was wrong. Deliberate, slow, like someone was testing the ground for creaks. I froze and strained my ears. It stopped. Then, minutes later, it started again, closer this time, circling the cabin. My heartbeat sped up. I kept my eyes on the dark window, watching for any shape to appear. Nothing. I tried to sleep, but the sound persisted. Every time I closed my eyes, I imagined someone outside, crouched in the shadows, watching. I could hear the soft scrape of shoes or boots over stone, the barely audible tap of fingers on wood. I thought about leaving, driving back down the forest path, but it was late, and I didn't want to navigate the dirt road in darkness. I kept telling myself it was my imagination, that being alone in such silence was making me hyper-aware. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. By morning, the fear hadn't left me. I stayed inside, pacing the cabin, trying to distract myself. The forest looked harmless in daylight, light filtering through the branches, birds finally singing. I explored a little, following the old path into the woods. The trees were thick, the ground covered in leaves and moss, and there were signs of wildlife: broken branches, animal tracks, but nothing human. I tried to convince myself that the sounds from the night before were probably a bear or a deer, nothing more. Yet when I returned to the cabin, I noticed small things that hadn't been there before. A scuff mark on the wooden porch, a small twig broken near the door, a faint set of footprints in the dirt that weren't mine. I spent the next few days in a careful routine. Morning walks into the forest, checking traps for wildlife, small chores around the cabin, cooking simple meals. The nights were the hardest. The sounds returned every night, not consistently but often enough to keep me on edge. I couldn't see anyone, but I could feel movement around the cabin, just beyond the edge of the trees. Sometimes the sound of a branch snapping would make me jump violently. I slept with a small hatchet beside the bed, imagining the worst-case scenario. I tried leaving the cabin during the night to confront whatever was there, but the forest at night was a labyrinth. I didn't know the area well enough to be safe. I stayed inside, keeping my curtains drawn and listening. One evening, I decided to examine the perimeter more carefully. I took a flashlight and a small rope, intending to mark boundaries and check for any human intruders. Walking around the cabin, the beam of light caught on a piece of metal half buried in the dirt. It looked like a small, discarded tool, a screwdriver or something similar. I crouched to inspect it, noticing nearby broken branches and footprints leading away from the cabin into thicker forest. I followed them cautiously, my flashlight bouncing across the trees. The prints were large, heavy, deliberate. They weren't animal. Whoever it was had been moving carefully, leaving just enough evidence for me to notice, but not enough to know how many people or what they wanted. I realized then that the sound I had been hearing at night was human. Someone walking around, watching, maybe even planning. I didn't know what they wanted, but I knew I couldn't underestimate it. The prints disappeared into a thick patch of brambles and dead leaves. I didn't go further. I returned to the cabin, locked every door, and checked the windows. I felt exposed, vulnerable, yet isolated with no help for miles. The next day, I decided I needed to leave. I packed my essentials and got into the car. Driving down the forest path, my eyes constantly scanned the shadows between the trees. I didn't want to look too closely, didn't want to give anyone the satisfaction of knowing I was afraid. The dirt road was longer and rougher in daylight than I remembered, and I drove slowly, every bump making my heart race. About halfway down, I noticed a figure standing between the trees, just at the edge of the path. I couldn't make out details, only the outline, but I slammed the gas pedal. The figure didn't move, didn't even seem to react, just stood there as if it had been waiting for me. I kept driving, not daring to look back, until the trees finally thinned and I reached the paved road. I didn't stop until I was back in town. The sense of isolation, of being watched, stayed with me long after I left the forest. I reported the cabin to the owner, who seemed surprised but agreed to send someone to check it. They found signs of trespassing, footprints, and evidence that someone had been living near the cabin intermittently for weeks or months. Nothing dangerous was left behind. No one confronted, no violence. Just signs that I had been watched. It was unnerving, yet somehow I felt lucky. I realized how small the margin between comfort and danger could be, how quickly isolation could turn from peaceful to threatening. Weeks later, I returned to the cabin with a professional guide and police support to retrieve some of my belongings. We found nothing suspicious on that visit, only the remnants of what had been a human presence. The guide explained it was likely someone trying to live off the land illegally, observing the cabin for supplies or shelter. I had planned the cabin trip for months. I needed time away from everything. Away from the city noise, the endless buzzing of notifications, the constant people and responsibilities that made me feel like I was living someone else's life. The idea was simple: a small, isolated cabin deep in the woods where I could hike, fish, read, and sleep in silence. I found a rental through a local listing, a modest wooden cabin tucked into a valley of dense pine trees, reachable only by a gravel road that twisted through miles of forest. The photos looked serene, cozy, untouched, and the reviews, though sparse, suggested it was the perfect escape. I packed my old backpack with essentials: a tent in case I wanted to sleep outside, warm clothes for the nights, a small supply of canned food, a portable stove, a first aid kit, a flashlight, batteries, a journal, and some books. I also brought a hand crank radio and a knife just in case. I left my phone on airplane mode as soon as I drove past the edge of the cell tower range, feeling a strange satisfaction at the idea of being completely off the grid. The drive was long, over 3 hours of winding roads and narrow bridges with nothing but trees and occasional farmland around me. As I left the main highway, the forest closed in so tightly that the road felt like it was part of the woods itself. Shadows stretched across the asphalt, and the sunlight was diffused through layers of pine and fir, turning the air golden in strange ways. Every turn in the road made me feel more and more like I was leaving the world behind. When I finally reached the cabin, I noticed it was exactly as pictured: small, wooden, surrounded by tall pines, with a thin plume of smoke curling from the chimney, though there was no one there. The cabin had a front porch, a small deck, and a screened window through which I could see the interior. A living area with a wood stove, a small kitchen, and 2 bedrooms. Everything smelled faintly of wood polish and dust, and the floors creaked under my weight in that satisfying way that made me feel I was alone in a real, untouched place. I set my backpack down and walked around, taking everything in: the trees, the slight rustle of leaves in the wind, the smell of damp earth, the feeling of isolation. It was quiet in a way that made me almost hold my breath. I spent the first afternoon exploring the immediate surroundings. The cabin was situated at the edge of a small clearing that led to a dense forest. There was a narrow trail that seemed to circle the cabin, disappearing into the trees. I followed it for a while, noticing how the undergrowth grew thick, the ground soft with moss and fallen pine needles. Birds flew overhead occasionally, and I could hear the distant sound of running water, probably a stream or creek. It was beautiful and peaceful, the kind of peace that was hard to find anywhere else. I returned to the cabin as dusk fell, lighting the wood stove to warm the space, and prepared a simple dinner of canned soup. The first night was calm, though I couldn't sleep well. The isolation made every sound seem amplified. Every crack in the floor, every gust of wind through the trees, sounded as if it were part of a larger, unseen presence. I eventually drifted off, comforted by the steady crackling of the fire. The next day, I hiked further into the woods. I wanted to find the creek I had heard and perhaps set up a small spot to fish. The forest was thick, and as I walked, I noticed that the trees grew closer together, the underbrush denser. Sunlight barely reached the ground in some areas, and I had to push branches aside to keep moving. Hours passed, and I realized that while I had been walking, the forest seemed to grow quieter. The birds stopped calling, and the wind died down. It felt as though the woods themselves were watching. I reached the creek eventually, a small ribbon of clear water cutting through the forest floor, and I sat for a while, resting and drinking from my water bottle. I marked the path back to the cabin mentally, paying attention to landmarks like unusual tree trunks and rocks. By evening, I was back at the cabin, and the sense of isolation had grown heavier. I could hear animals moving in the forest, small things, most likely deer or rabbits, but something about their movement made me tense. Shadows seemed to linger longer than they should, and every rustle in the distance made my heart beat faster. I told myself it was just the mind reacting to being alone, and I tried to focus on mundane tasks: stacking firewood, cleaning the cabin, and writing in my journal. The second night, sleep was worse. Around midnight, I woke to a loud crack outside, like a tree branch snapping close to the cabin. I froze, listening. There was nothing else. I told myself it was probably a branch falling in the wind. I tried to sleep again, but every snap, every rustle, seemed louder and closer than before. I kept imagining movement in the trees, shadows that didn't belong, and I realized that the forest, quiet as it seemed, was alive with its own hidden activity. The following day, I decided to explore more extensively, moving further from the cabin. I had packed a small map I found online, but it wasn't precise. The woods were more intricate than I expected. Paths twisted, dead-ended, and occasionally vanished under overgrown foliage. I kept marking my trail with small stacks of stones and broken branches, but despite my precautions, I felt a creeping uncertainty. I tried to convince myself that getting lost wasn't possible. I had survival experience, but still, the forest felt like it was constantly shifting, making it hard to retrace my steps. By mid-afternoon, I realized that I had ventured farther than I had intended. My sense of direction, usually reliable, felt clouded. Trees that should have looked familiar all seemed identical. I stopped to rest by a large boulder, sweating and trying to calm my racing thoughts. I looked around, noting the lack of distinct landmarks, and panic began to creep in. The trail markers I had left were hard to spot among the dense underbrush, and the sun was already low. I made the decision to turn back. I started retracing my steps, but the forest seemed different somehow. Shadows had lengthened, the wind had changed direction, and my previous mental map felt unreliable. Every path looked the same. Every tree was a potential landmark, but none felt right. Hours passed. The sun sank below the horizon, and I realized that I would not make it back to the cabin before nightfall. My flashlight had fresh batteries, but I knew it wasn't enough for the hours ahead. I tried to calm myself, focusing on moving steadily, but the dark forest had a way of amplifying every small fear. Night fell completely. The woods became an oppressive black, and I was acutely aware of the sounds around me. Leaves rustled, twigs snapped under my feet, and every distant animal call sounded closer than it should. I stumbled over roots and rocks, scraped my arms on branches, and kept telling myself that the cabin was not far, that I could find it, that panicking would only make things worse. But the sense of being completely alone, with no human presence for miles, gnawed at my resolve. Eventually, I found a small clearing and decided I had to make a choice: keep moving blindly in the dark or find a spot to stay until morning. I chose the latter, digging a small depression in the leaf litter, covering myself with branches, and keeping the flashlight close. I had some water and a few snacks in my pack, enough to survive the night. I tried to focus on survival basics, staying warm, staying hydrated, keeping my mind alert, but sleep came fitfully. Every noise made me tense, every shadow seemed like movement, and I stayed awake for long stretches, shivering in the cold. When morning finally arrived, the light revealed the forest in a completely different way. The trees were not threatening anymore. just immense and quiet. I gathered myself, assessed my surroundings, and realized I had no idea which direction the cabin was. I retraced my steps from memory, following patterns in the terrain, the slope of the land, the flow of water, anything that seemed familiar. I moved slowly, deliberately, taking care not to injure myself. By late morning, I found the creek I had discovered before. Relief surged through me, and I followed it downstream, remembering that the cabin had been near running water. The path eventually led me to a faint dirt track that connected to the main gravel road. I stumbled onto it, exhausted, bleeding from a few minor scrapes, and saw the familiar outline of the cabin in the distance. The sight was like seeing civilization after a long shipwreck. I returned to the cabin, collapsing on the porch and taking in deep, shuddering breaths. I felt a mix of relief and gratitude for the simple safety of a roof over my head. I cleaned my scrapes, tended to minor injuries, and sat by the fire, reflecting on the ordeal. The forest, as beautiful as it was, had a relentless, indifferent quality. It was alive in a way humans could not fully control or predict. The isolation that had seemed so alluring was, in reality, raw and consuming. I realized the true danger had not been some fantastical presence, but the combination of my own unpreparedness and I had been looking forward to this trip for months, a chance to disconnect completely from the noise of the city and the pressure of work. The idea of a small cabin in the woods, surrounded by nothing but trees, the occasional sound of birds, and the distant flow of a creek, seemed like the perfect way to unwind. I had driven for hours through winding back roads and stretches of dense forest, following a map I had printed weeks earlier. The GPS was spotty at best, and in some areas it simply didn't work at all. I welcomed that. The sense of being out in the middle of nowhere, unreachable and unseen, gave me a strange comfort I couldn't explain. The cabin itself was older than I expected, but solid. It had a weathered look, with grayish-brown siding that had faded over the years, and a small porch that creaked underfoot. The windows were dusty, some streaked with the remnants of rain from weeks past, but otherwise intact. I parked the car and grabbed my gear, backpack, sleeping bag, some food, water, and a small first aid kit. The cabin had electricity and a wood stove, which I confirmed as I stepped inside. The smell of old wood and faint mildew hit me immediately, but it wasn't unpleasant. It smelled lived in, like it had a history, and I liked that. Inside, the cabin was small, maybe 2 rooms and a loft, with a main living area and a tiny kitchen. The furniture was simple, worn, but usable. A small table with 2 chairs sat near the window, and there was a futon pushed against the wall. The loft above, accessed by a narrow wooden ladder, had a mattress and a couple of blankets. I set down my backpack and walked around, inspecting the place. The windows were covered with light curtains, letting in the muted sunlight filtering through the trees outside. I opened a few to get some air circulating, enjoying the smell of pine mixed with the damp earth outside. I spent the first part of the afternoon unpacking and organizing. I stacked some firewood near the stove, laid out my sleeping bag, and even cleaned a few surfaces that had accumulated dust. By the time I finished, the sun was dipping low, casting long shadows through the trees and making the forest seem deeper, darker, and more mysterious. I started a small fire in the stove and sat nearby, feeling the warmth creep through the cabin. The quiet was almost overwhelming, not in a bad way, but in a way that made me hyper-aware of every little noise. The creak of the cabin settling, the occasional rustle of leaves from a light breeze, the distant sound of what I assumed were small animals moving through the underbrush. It all felt amplified in the emptiness. As night fell, I realized that I hadn't heard any other humans since I parked. The nearest neighbor was at least a mile away, maybe more, and there were no cars passing through. That solitude, which had felt peaceful during the day, now carried a weight of tension. I reminded myself that I had chosen this. I had wanted this isolation. Still, the feeling in the pit of my stomach wasn't easy to shake. I decided to get some dinner ready. Using a small camping stove, I heated some canned soup and bread I had brought. I ate slowly, paying attention to the way the firelight flickered against the walls and ceiling. Shadows moved and danced, but there was nothing in them, just the fire's reflection. Afterward, I washed up in the small sink, filling the basin with water from the cabin's tap. The water smelled faintly of iron, but it was drinkable. By the time I climbed the ladder to the loft and settled onto the mattress, I was exhausted. I lay there, staring at the rough-hewn ceiling above me, listening to the night. Outside, the forest was alive with sound. Birds calling to each other, small animals scurrying through the underbrush, the wind rustling the trees. Everything seemed normal, natural, but my mind was on edge, as if expecting something to go wrong. I drifted in and out of sleep. At some point, I heard a distinct sound, a soft, deliberate crunch of footsteps outside the cabin. I froze, heart hammering. It was too heavy for a small animal. The sound stopped after a few seconds, and silence returned. I told myself it must be another hiker or someone passing by, and tried to ignore it. But sleep was impossible after that. Every creak of the cabin, every rustle outside, felt magnified. I lay awake, wide-eyed, listening and calculating. By the time dawn broke, I was drained. I got up, made coffee, and forced myself to eat a little breakfast. I told myself I needed to remain calm, rational. There was no reason for anyone to be near the cabin at that hour, and if someone had been, they were probably gone. I stepped outside, hoping that seeing the forest in daylight would calm my nerves. The morning was quiet, almost unnaturally so. The air was crisp, and the sunlight filtered softly through the trees, painting patches of gold on the forest floor. I decided to explore the immediate surroundings. The cabin sat on a small clearing, maybe a quarter-acre in size, surrounded on all sides by thick forest. I walked along the edge of the clearing, noticing the tracks in the soft dirt, some deer or other animals, and a few I couldn't identify. The ground was disturbed near the side of the cabin. My heart sank slightly. Someone had definitely been here. I tried to recall if I had left any windows open, if there were signs of forced entry, but everything seemed normal. No broken locks, nothing missing. Still, the evidence of someone's presence lingered. The next few days passed in a tense routine. I forced myself to go for hikes, gather firewood, and do small chores around the cabin. Each night, though, I heard noises, footsteps, rustling, the faint sound of voices carried by the wind that were never close enough to make out. My imagination churned constantly. I double-checked my doors and windows, made sure the stove was safe, and set up a small perimeter with makeshift alarms, empty cans tied to string that would rattle if disturbed. On the third night, the footsteps returned, louder this time, circling the cabin. I stayed in the loft, flashlight in hand, waiting. Hours passed. The footsteps came and went, sometimes stopping right outside, sometimes fading into the distance. It was relentless. The cabin, once a refuge, now felt like a trap. I couldn't escape easily. The nearest road was miles away, and even if I tried to drive, I would be spotted or confronted before reaching safety. I started documenting everything, writing it down in a small notebook. Each incident, the time, the direction, the pattern. By observing closely, I realized the footsteps followed a pattern. They never came during the day, and they moved in small circles around the cabin at night. Whoever or whatever it was seemed to be studying the place, waiting. This realization did not help my anxiety. It made it worse. I felt trapped, under constant surveillance, and the isolation of the forest amplified every fear. The following night, I prepared for the worst. I gathered firewood, sharpened a small hatchet, and kept a knife within reach. I barricaded the doors as best I could and set my makeshift alarms in strategic locations. I kept the flashlight close and my phone charged, though the signal was weak, barely enough to send texts. The footsteps began around 11 p.m. I lay in wait, every sense heightened. They circled the cabin, stopping at one point where a low branch had scratched against the siding. My heart nearly stopped. I stayed perfectly still, barely breathing, waiting for a confrontation that never came. By dawn, the sounds faded, leaving only silence. That morning, I realized I couldn't stay in the cabin any longer without taking some action. I needed to leave, but I had to be smart. I packed my essentials quietly, keeping a low profile. I waited until around 10 a.m. when I thought it was safe to move and made my way toward the car. I took a route I had scouted days before, moving through thicker forest that would provide cover. I tried to stay calm, but every snapping twig or rustling leaf made me freeze. I reached the car after nearly an hour. It had been untouched exactly where I left it. I locked the doors and drove slowly back toward the main road, constantly scanning for signs of anyone following. The drive was tense, but uneventful. Eventually, the familiar sight of civilization appeared: the paved road, houses, other cars. I exhaled a long, shaky breath. I had escaped, but the cabin, once a place of solitude, had become a memory I would never forget. When I finally reached my apartment, I called the local authorities and reported the incidents, providing all the details I had recorded. They assured me they would check the cabin and surrounding area. Weeks later, I learned from the police that there had been reports of trespassers in that area, a group targeting isolated cabins for theft. Thankfully, nothing had been stolen from mine, but the presence of others nearby, moving silently and watching, explained the disturbances. I realized how lucky I had been to stay safe and unharmed, and how easily a different decision could have led to a far worse outcome. From that experience, I learned the importance I had been looking forward to this weekend for weeks. My life had been a blur of constant noise and pressure, a never-ending routine of work, deadlines, and people who seemed to demand everything I had while giving nothing back. The idea of escaping into the woods, leaving the city far behind, was intoxicating. I didn't care much about the cabin itself, except that it was remote and had a reputation for being quiet and isolated. I didn't want convenience. I wanted solitude, the kind where no sound came except for wind in the trees or the occasional snap of a branch under some small animal's foot. I had been so desperate for that kind of silence that the warning signs I'd read about the road leading to the cabin seemed trivial. I thought I would manage them easily. The drive began in the late morning, the sun already high in the sky. I took the highway out of town, passing familiar landmarks that slowly began to feel distant and inconsequential. As I left the last stretch of suburban sprawl behind, the landscape changed. Lawns gave way to wild fields, and small houses became spaced far apart, eventually replaced by thick clusters of pine and oak. The air felt different here, heavier, more alive, carrying the scent of soil and decay from the undergrowth. The road narrowed as I veered off the main highway, a thin ribbon of asphalt that had clearly been patched in multiple places, lines fading, edges crumbling into gravel. By the time I reached the dirt path that led to the cabin, the sun had shifted lower, casting long shadows between the trees. The path was barely wide enough for a car, littered with fallen branches and rocks. Every mile I drove deeper into the forest made the world behind me seem like a dream. When I finally reached the clearing where the cabin sat, I stopped the car, took a deep breath, and stepped out. The air was cooler here, the kind that felt like it could seep into your bones. The cabin was small but solid, made of rough-hewn logs and a steep, shingled roof. A thin trail of smoke rose from the chimney, a sign that the place was at least somewhat prepared for visitors. A stack of firewood leaned against one side, neatly arranged, and the porch, though a little warped with age, looked sturdy. Windows reflected the fading light like dark mirrors, and I felt a flicker of unease at the way the forest seemed to press close around the cabin, like the trees themselves were leaning in to watch. I shook off the thought. I was alone, completely alone, and that's exactly what I had wanted. Inside, the cabin smelled of wood and old smoke. There were 2 rooms, a small living area with a stone fireplace and a bedroom with a bed, modest but comfortable. The kitchen area was tiny, just a counter with a sink, a small stove, and a few shelves with basic utensils and canned food. I dropped my bags on the floor and walked to the window. The forest stretched endlessly in every direction, shadows deepening as dusk approached. I lit a fire in the fireplace, the crackling flames throwing flickering light across the room. For a moment, I felt at peace. Night fell quickly. The forest outside became a dense black, the kind that seems to absorb all sound. I ate a simple dinner, washed the dishes, and settled into the bed with a book, the fire slowly dying down in the fireplace. Then I heard it. A faint sound outside, almost imperceptible, but distinct in the heavy silence. At first, I thought it was an animal, a deer moving through the underbrush or maybe a raccoon. But as I listened, the sound became a pattern. A deliberate scraping, slow and irregular, like someone dragging a heavy object across the ground. My heart began to beat faster. I told myself it was nothing, that the forest had noises I wasn't used to. Still, I stood and moved to the window. Peering out, I saw nothing. The trees swayed gently in the wind, shadows stretching and twisting. I waited, straining to hear anything else. Minutes passed. The sound returned, closer this time, more deliberate. Scraping, dragging, stopping, then moving again. Panic started to creep in. I grabbed a flashlight from the shelf and stepped onto the porch. The beam of light cut through the darkness, revealing nothing but trees and undergrowth. I walked the perimeter of the cabin slowly, shining the light into every shadow, every gap between the trees. Still, there was nothing. Yet the sound persisted, sometimes behind me, sometimes to the side, always just beyond the reach of the light. Returning inside, I locked the doors and windows, double-checked the latches, and sat near the fireplace with a knife I kept in my backpack. Hours passed. The fire died completely, leaving the room in near darkness. The scraping outside continued intermittently. I could hear twigs snapping, leaves rustling, but no footsteps, no voices, nothing human. Yet there was a sense that I was being observed. That thought alone made it impossible to relax. I stayed awake all night, holding the knife, listening to the intermittent, deliberate sounds of movement outside. Morning came, pale and gray, filtering weakly through the trees. I opened the door cautiously. The forest was empty. No animals, no humans. No sign of anything unusual except a long, narrow trail of disturbed dirt that led from the edge of the clearing into the woods. I followed it a few steps but stopped. The trail disappeared among the trees. I decided I would not venture far. I spent the day preparing the cabin as best I could, stacking firewood closer to the porch, reinforcing the doors with extra planks I found in a corner, and ensuring I had access to water. Still, the previous night's fear lingered, like a shadow clinging to me. That night, the sound returned, worse than before. It wasn't just scraping. It was heavier now, more insistent. I couldn't see the source, but I could hear the subtle crunch of leaves and twigs under deliberate pressure. A pattern that suggested someone or something was circling the cabin, testing me, watching. I felt trapped. My mind raced with scenarios, all of them terrifying. I could call the police, but the phone signal was almost non-existent out here. I could try to escape, but the road back was miles of unlit dirt paths, and any movement outside would give away my location. I stayed inside, listening, every muscle tensed. Hours passed. I tried to keep track of the noises, mapping the circling pattern, trying to figure out if there was a break I could exploit. At some point, the sounds stopped, abruptly, leaving a silence so complete that it pressed on my ears. I stayed awake the entire night, waiting, flashlight and knife in hand, body rigid and alert. The next morning, I decided to investigate more carefully. I took a small backpack, packed water, food, and the knife, and began walking the perimeter of the cabin. That's when I found it. Footprints. Large human footprints, wet and fresh, leading from the edge of the forest to the cabin and back again. They were irregular, as if whoever had made them was cautious, deliberate, checking angles, perhaps testing doors or windows. They ended abruptly at the tree lean, disappearing into the thick undergrowth. My stomach turned. Someone had been out there all night, moving through the shadows while I slept. I realized then that I couldn't stay here. The fear I had been able to suppress during the day returned tenfold. I packed my things quickly, stacking what I could onto my car. I didn't dare make noise, didn't dare linger. I kept my knife in my hand as I unlocked the cabin door and stepped outside. The air was thick with the scent of wet earth and pine, the kind of smell that makes you aware of how alone you are. The drive back was tense. Every shadow on the road made me flinch. Every rustle in the trees made me jolt. I kept the windows rolled up, doors locked, hands gripping the steering wheel. The sun was low, and the forest seemed to close around me as I retraced the winding path through the dirt roads. I thought I saw movement in the trees, but every time I blinked or refocused, it was gone. The forest seemed endless, a maze designed to trap anyone who ventured too deep. Eventually, I reached the main highway, and the forest gave way to the familiar landscape of fields, small towns, and finally, the city outskirts. I didn't stop driving until I was back in town, lights of houses and street lamps a comforting sight. I parked in my driveway, heart still racing, and sat in the car for a long time, listening to the sounds of my neighborhood, the distant hum of traffic, and the chatter of people who had no idea what it was like to be completely alone in a place that could swallow you without a trace. The cabin remained in my thoughts for weeks afterward. I couldn't explain why someone had been out there, watching, circling, leaving footprints in the dirt. There were no signs of theft or vandalism, no evidence that anything had been taken or damaged. Yet, the memory of that night, the scraping, the deliberate, silent presence moving through the shadows, haunted me. It left a mark, a realization that isolation, while beautiful, also carried real, tangible danger. Eventually, I sold the cabin rental before anyone else could experience the same fear I had. I visited other remote places afterward, always cautious. I had always enjoyed the quiet of the forest, the way the wind moved through the tall pines, the creak of branches in the night, and the smell of damp earth after a long rain had always comforted me. This cabin trip was supposed to be a way to escape from the noise of the city, from the constant hum of people and traffic, from responsibilities that never seemed to stop pressing down. I had packed a small bag with the essentials: some clothes, my camera, a few notebooks, a first aid kit, food that didn't require much preparation, and a large flashlight with extra batteries. I had made sure to check the cabin's location on the map and to note the access road. I had planned to drive as far as I could, then hike a short distance to the cabin nestled deep in the woods. The road leading to the cabin was rough, a gravel path winding through dense trees. The further I drove, the quieter it became. The occasional chirping of birds or rustling of small animals was the only sound. By the time I parked my car at the trailhead, it was late afternoon, and the forest had already begun to settle into the kind of quiet that felt almost alive, as if the trees themselves were watching me move. The weight of isolation pressed down in a subtle way that I had never felt in the city. I hoisted my backpack and started walking. The path was narrow, barely maintained, lined with fallen leaves and broken branches. Every step I took seemed louder than it should have been, echoing through the emptiness around me. By the time I reached the cabin, the sun was beginning to sink below the horizon, and the light that filtered through the trees was weak and golden, turning shadows long and dark. The cabin itself was modest, built of dark wood, with a stone chimney on one side. It looked as though it had been built decades ago, but it had been cared for, at least superficially. The windows were intact, the door had a functional lock, and the small porch was swept clean. I set my bag down and took a moment to just look at it, breathing in the cold air that smelled faintly of pine and wet soil. The feeling of being utterly alone began to creep over me, a creeping awareness that this was a place where anything that happened would be entirely up to me to deal with. I unlocked the door and went inside. The cabin was simple: a single room with a small kitchen area, a wood-burning stove, a table, a couple of chairs, and a sleeping loft accessible by a steep ladder. The smell of old wood and dust hit me immediately. I set my things down and went to inspect the stove, checking that there was a supply of wood and that it worked. The cabin had electricity, but I preferred using the stove. It seemed more reliable in case the power went out. After collecting some firewood, I started a small fire, the smell of smoke filling the room, giving it a sense of warmth and security. The sun had almost completely disappeared, and darkness began to press against the walls. Night in the forest is different than night in the city. In the city, darkness is softened by streetlights, distant traffic, neon signs, the constant flicker of life. Here, darkness has weight. It isn't just the absence of light, it's a presence in itself, filling spaces and creeping along the edges of your vision. The first night, I tried to ignore it, telling myself that I had nothing to fear. I ate a small dinner of canned beans and bread, then sat near the fire trying to write in my notebook. My hand shook slightly as I scribbled, a combination of fatigue and the slight unease that I could feel but not quite identify. Every so often, I would hear a snap outside, a branch breaking under some unseen weight, and my heart would jump. But I reminded myself of the logical possibilities. Deer, raccoons, the wind. The first night passed without incident, though I barely slept. Every sound made me flinch. Every shadow seemed to shift in the corners of my eyes. When morning came, it felt like a relief, as if I had survived some unseen trial. I went outside to stretch, to take in the air, to listen to the forest with a more awake mind. The path leading back toward the trailhead was faintly visible, and I could see the tops of the distant mountains through the trees. The sun lit everything with a gentle warmth that made the forest feel less oppressive. But still, the knowledge of what the night could bring lingered. I spent the next few days exploring the area around the cabin. There were small streams that cut through the forest, tiny clearings filled with wildflowers, and hills that gave a view over the dense woods. I marked some of these locations on a map, partly for fun, partly in case I needed to find my way quickly in an emergency. The forest was beautiful, and the isolation was peaceful, but a low-level anxiety never left me. Every rustle of leaves, every distant thump, every shadow that seemed to move just beyond my vision reminded me that I was alone, completely alone. On the fourth night, things began to change. I was in the cabin preparing dinner when I heard it. A series of deliberate, heavy knocks on the side of the cabin. They were slow, methodical, not the random noise of falling branches. My heart jumped into my throat. I froze, listening. The knocking stopped. I waited, holding my breath, straining my ears. The wind had picked up, rustling the trees, but there was no other sound. I tried to tell myself it was a tree branch falling, an animal, but something about the rhythm, the force, the very sound of it felt deliberate. My mind raced with possibilities, all of them unpleasant. I checked the windows, securing them as best I could, and made sure the door was locked. I didn't have a phone signal out here, and I realized for the first time just how isolated I was. If something went wrong, there was no one to call, no one to help. The fire in the stove seemed inadequate against the creeping fear that filled the cabin. That night, I didn't sleep at all. I stayed near the fire, my eyes darting to every shadow, every corner, every movement. I kept thinking I saw figures moving outside, but when I looked, there was nothing but the forest. My imagination, I told myself. The following morning, I decided to investigate carefully. I stepped outside and walked around the cabin, looking for any sign of what could have caused the noise. The ground was soft from recent rains, and I could see prints, large boot prints leading away from the cabin toward the woods. They weren't mine. They were too big, too deliberate, and they disappeared into the forest without a trace. I felt my stomach tighten. Someone had been there, had been close enough to knock on the cabin, had left no other trace. I considered leaving immediately, but the thought of hiking back alone through unfamiliar terrain filled me with dread. I spent the next day preparing. I collected extra firewood, ensured the stove was ready, and even fashioned makeshift barricades for the windows. I knew it was futile against a determined intruder, but it gave me a sense of control. I also packed my bag in case I had to leave quickly. That night, I stayed awake again, every sound making me flinch, every movement outside making me tense. I saw shadows moving in the corners of the trees, but when I shone a flashlight, there was nothing. I began to realize that whoever or whatever had been there might be hiding, waiting, watching. The nights grew worse. The knocks returned, always deliberate, always on the side of the cabin that faced the forest. I learned to recognize the pattern. 3 slow knocks, pause, 1 quick knock, then silence. Sometimes there were footprints outside the door in the morning, sometimes not. I felt hunted, constantly aware of every sound, every movement, every gust of wind. The isolation that had once been comforting now felt suffocating. I began sleeping in the loft, hoping that being higher would give me some advantage if someone tried to break in. I kept a fire going, kept my backpack ready, and kept my hands on a heavy piece of firewood that I had carved into a makeshift club. By the seventh night, I was exhausted mentally and physically. My body ached from constant tension. My mind raced with scenarios and plans, all of them terrifying. I realized that staying in the cabin was no longer safe. Whoever had been there, whoever had left the prints, had clearly been watching me, and I had no way of knowing when or if they would return. I decided I had to leave. At first light, I packed everything into my bag, leaving nothing behind that couldn't be carried. I double-checked the door, made sure the stove was out, and took a deep breath. The forest seemed calmer in the daylight, but I kept my eyes on every movement, every shadow, every sound. I followed the trail back to my car, moving slowly and deliberately, listening constantly. I didn't see anyone, but the sense of being watched never left me. When I finally reached the car, my hands shook so badly I could barely get the keys into the ignition. I started the engine and drove away, keeping to the narrow road, never slowing down until the cabin was far behind me. By the time I reached a town with a gas station and a phone signal, the tension in my body began to ease. I called the local sheriff and reported what had happened, describing the knocks, the footprints, the sense of being watched. They took the report seriously and promised to investigate, though I knew it was unlikely they would find anything definitive in the dense forest. I realized that I had survived. I had always wanted to spend a week alone in the wilderness, away from the noise of the city, away from people, schedules, and responsibilities. I found a cabin online, far in the mountains, that seemed perfect. It wasn't luxurious, but it was remote, built of rough-hewn logs, with a small wood stove, a well for water, and a tiny kitchen. The photos showed the surrounding forest, dense and quiet, and I imagined mornings waking to the smell of pine and the sound of birds. I packed my car with supplies for a week: food, water, camping gear, extra blankets, a first aid kit, a flashlight, batteries, and tools. I left a note with my family telling them where I would be, which I figured was enough. I wanted this solitude, and I wanted it to be untouched by anyone else's presence. The drive up the mountain was long and narrow. At first, the road was paved, but eventually it narrowed to gravel and then dirt. The trees grew thicker, and the air smelled fresher but colder. The sun was low by the time I arrived at a small clearing where the cabin sat. It looked exactly like the photos. Simple, sturdy, surrounded by tall pine trees, with a narrow path leading to a creek nearby. I parked and took a deep breath. The silence hit me first. Not just the quiet of nature, but a hollow, stretched silence that felt almost unnatural. It wasn't uncomfortable yet, but it made me hyper-aware of every sound. The crunch of gravel under my boots, the faint rustle of leaves, the distant cry of a hawk. I unloaded my car, carrying the boxes of food and supplies inside. The cabin smelled of old wood and dust. There were cobwebs in the corners and a thin layer of dirt on the floors, but it was habitable. I lit a fire in the stove to warm it up, and I made a simple dinner from canned beans and a small loaf of bread I had brought. As night fell, the forest outside became darker than I had imagined. Shadows from the trees stretched across the clearing, and the wind began to whistle through the branches. I didn't feel scared, not yet, but I felt aware. Alone in a forest at night, there was no one to help if something went wrong. Every crack from the wood, every snap from a distant branch, made me glance toward the windows. The first night passed uneventfully, though I slept lightly. I had trouble keeping the fire going, which made me wake every hour to add more wood. When I looked outside, I could see the moonlight filtering through the trees, casting sharp, moving shadows. I could hear the creek nearby, a soothing sound that also reminded me I was truly alone. I thought about the animals that might roam near the cabin: deer, raccoons, maybe even a bear, but I had packed bear spray, so I felt prepared. Still, a small part of me was aware that this place was not like any city apartment I had ever lived in. Out here, nature wasn't background scenery. It was active and it could be dangerous. The next morning, I explored the area around the cabin. The forest was dense, with tall pines, thick underbrush, and patches of moss. The air smelled damp, earthy, and fresh. I followed the narrow path to the creek. The water was cold and clear, running over rocks with a gentle gurgle. I drank directly from it after filtering it with my portable filter. I noticed animal tracks in the mud. Deer, small foxes, a raccoon. Nothing that seemed threatening. The sun was high, and the forest looked peaceful in the light. But the deeper I went, the quieter it became. Even the birds seemed to fade as I went farther from the cabin. I returned with a sense of satisfaction. This was exactly what I had wanted. The solitude, the challenge, and the beauty of untouched nature. That evening, I made a fire again and cooked a small dinner. I sat outside on the porch, watching the light fade from the treetops, the sky turning pink and then dark blue. The forest at dusk had a weight to it. The shadows stretched long, and the air cooled quickly. I could hear small animals rustling in the underbrush, and somewhere far off, the sound of branches snapping, maybe a deer or a wolf. My imagination tried to fill in the gaps, but I reminded myself that most animals would avoid humans. Still, the thought made me double-check the cabin doors and windows before I went to sleep. I had no phone reception, no internet, and I couldn't hear any other human voices. The only sounds were natural, but that made them sharper, more immediate, and more threatening in a way. The next day, I decided to hike a longer trail I had seen on the map. It would take me deeper into the forest, along ridges and valleys, with no guarantee of finding anyone else. I packed water, a few snacks, my compass, and a small first aid kit. The trail was rough, overgrown in places, with roots and loose rocks making footing tricky. After a couple of hours, I noticed the forest growing eerily silent. Not just the absence of human noise, but the absence of bird calls, wind in the trees, and rustling underbrush. It was as if the forest had paused. My stomach tightened. I remembered reading about hikers getting lost or attacked by animals in remote forests. I tried to stay calm and retraced my steps to a familiar landmark, a large rock formation near the trailhead. It took longer than I expected, and the sun was beginning to dip toward the horizon by the time I returned. I felt relief when I finally saw the cabin, its small silhouette through the trees, warm light flickering from the stove chimney. The next night was colder. The temperature had dropped significantly, and the wind was louder, rattling the cabin's walls. I stacked extra wood against the stove and tried to sleep, but every sound outside, the snap of a branch, a rustle in the leaves, the distant howl of an animal, kept me awake. At one point, I thought I saw movement through the window, a dark shape moving among the trees. I froze, heart racing, straining my eyes in the darkness. It vanished, and I told myself it was a shadow or an animal. But the uncertainty gnawed at me. I decided to keep a hatchet and a flashlight by my bed, just in case. The following morning, I woke early and walked to the creek to refresh myself. I noticed something strange. There were new footprints in the mud, larger than mine, human-shaped, leading from the forest toward the cabin, and then back again. Panic rose in my chest. Had someone been near the cabin last night? I checked the cabin carefully. Doors locked, windows closed. Nothing appeared missing. I considered packing and leaving immediately, but reminded myself that the footprints could be old, maybe from hikers passing during the day. Still, it was unsettling. I decided to stay vigilant, not letting my imagination get the better of me. Over the next 2 days, I became increasingly aware of sounds at night. Faint footsteps, distant rustling, and sometimes a sense of being watched. The isolation that had once felt peaceful was becoming oppressive. My mind raced with scenarios, some realistic, some improbable. I reinforced the cabin doors with extra logs and set up a perimeter with small stones and sticks around the cabin to notice any new disturbances. During the day, I explored only close to the cabin, never straying far from familiar ground. Every shadow seemed longer, every rustle sharper. I noticed that the forest seemed almost too still at times, as if it was watching me back. Then, on the fourth night, it happened. Around midnight, I woke to a sound I could not immediately identify. It was heavy footsteps outside, not light, careful steps, but slow, deliberate. I froze, listening. The footsteps circled the cabin, coming close to the windows, then retreating. My heart raced, and I felt a surge of fear I had never experienced before. I gripped the hatchet tightly. I considered shouting or running, but I knew that if someone with bad intentions was outside, that could provoke them. I stayed quiet, barely breathing, listening. The footsteps eventually stopped, and after what felt like an eternity, I heard the sound of the wind again, and nothing else. The next morning, I found something that confirmed my fears. Scratch marks on the wooden door frame, deep and jagged, as if someone or something had tried to force entry. There were also more footprints around the cabin, larger than mine, and unmistakably human. Panic set in. I packed essentials quickly, leaving most of my supplies, and loaded my car. Driving down the dirt road was tense. I kept checking behind me, expecting to see someone following, though I knew it was unlikely. The forest seemed different now, oppressive and threatening. The silence I had enjoyed before now felt dangerous, like the trees themselves were hiding something. When I finally reached the paved road, I felt a wave of relief. My phone signal returned, and I called the local authorities to report what had happened. They said the area had occasional hikers and hunters, but no reports of intruders. I told them about the footprints and scratches. They promised to send a ranger to check, and I felt safer knowing someone else would be there. Driving back to civilization, I felt the tension slowly drain from my body. I realized that while the wilderness was beautiful, it also demanded respect and caution. My time in I had been driving for hours, long enough that the landscape outside my window had shifted from the familiar patterns of highway signs and suburban sprawl to the irregular, almost threatening silhouettes of dense forest. The late afternoon sun was low, burning orange through the tall pines and casting long, twisting shadows across the narrow, uneven road. My GPS signal kept flickering in and out, leaving me with only vague estimates of distance. I didn't mind. I liked the isolation. It was the reason I had chosen this cabin in the first place. A week away from the city, from constant notifications, from the noise of life. The cabin was advertised as remote, rustic, and entirely cut off. That was what I wanted. That was what I was paying for. I turned off the last paved road onto a dirt track, which immediately turned into a narrow path, barely wide enough for my car. The tires crunched over loose gravel and compacted dirt. Small rocks bounced against the sides of the car. I slowed down. The further I went, the denser the forest became, and the sunlight dimmed under the thick canopy. Every few minutes, I caught movement out of the corner of my eye, but when I looked directly, there was nothing. Just trees, thick underbrush, and occasional fallen logs. Somewhere deep in the woods, a bird called sharply, breaking the eerie silence. The cabin finally appeared around a bend, almost hidden. It was smaller than I expected. A simple wooden structure with dark-stained walls and a steep roof. Moss had grown on the shingles, and the porch steps were worn from years of exposure. There was a small stone chimney, and the windows were grimy, reflecting the deepening shadows of the trees. The entire place looked like it had been left alone for decades. I parked beside it, the tires sinking slightly into soft dirt. The smell of damp wood and earth filled the air. I stepped out, and the quiet was nearly complete. I could hear my own breath and the creaking of the porch boards under my weight. The first thing I noticed inside was the smell, a mix of mildew and old wood. The cabin had a small, rectangular living space with a stone fireplace at one end, a simple kitchen area along one wall, and a narrow staircase leading to a loft. Dust lay in thick layers on the furniture, and spider webs hung in corners. The floorboards creaked underfoot. I moved slowly, inspecting the space. There was no running water. The electrical outlets were old and corroded, and the only light came from small windows that let in the fading sunlight. I knew it would be dark soon. I unpacked my supplies, checked the fireplace, and gathered firewood from a stack outside. As the night approached, the forest seemed to grow louder. Small noises, which I had ignored during the day, became pronounced. A branch snapping in the distance, the rustle of leaves, something heavy moving through underbrush. I told myself it was probably a deer or maybe a raccoon, but the sounds didn't follow the normal patterns of wildlife. They were irregular, intermittent, sometimes closer, sometimes further, but always distinct. My heartbeat started to pick up as the sun disappeared completely behind the horizon. The temperature dropped sharply. I stacked more wood in the fireplace and lit it. The first flame sparked and hissed, then roared to life. The room was suddenly warmer, the shadows of the fire flickering across the walls. I tried to focus on that warmth, on the routine of setting up a week of solitude. Around 10 o'clock, I went to check the loft. The bed was small and covered with a rough, old quilt. Dust motes floated in the air, highlighted by the firelight below. I decided to leave the main door unlocked. I didn't expect anyone else to come here, but the thought of being trapped made me uneasy. I had my phone, but service was weak, almost non-existent. If something went wrong, I was largely on my own. I sat on the edge of the bed, listening. The forest outside was alive with sound. Low, groaning noises I couldn't identify, branches scratching against each other. My imagination started filling in the blanks. I kept telling myself to calm down. I was here alone, I had planned this. Nothing could happen. I woke several times that night. Every sound made me tense. A heavy thud outside the cabin sent me sitting upright in bed, my ears straining. I waited. Nothing. I convinced myself it was the wind, but I couldn't ignore the feeling that something had moved close to the cabin, perhaps watching. I kept the fireplace smoldering, the light throwing shadows that I hoped would keep me from being surprised. Every creak of the floorboards or groan of the wood made me jump. Sleep came in short, uneasy bursts, always interrupted. Morning brought some relief. The light made everything look less threatening. I stepped outside, the frost from the night crunching under my boots. The air was crisp, clean, and smelled of pine. I decided to explore a bit, walking along a narrow trail behind the cabin. The forest was dense, almost suffocating. I noticed marks on tree trunks, deep scratches that didn't look like they were made by animals. My mind immediately went to the worst-case scenarios. I tried to rationalize them. Maybe the marks were from logging equipment or some natural phenomenon. But there was a pattern to them, deliberate, and I couldn't shake the unease. I returned to the cabin and spent the day gathering more firewood and clearing a small area around the cabin. Every so often, I would stop and listen. The forest never truly went silent. Even during the day, the sounds had a weight to them, as if something was moving deliberately, just out of sight. I kept telling myself that humans had been in this area before me, hunters or hikers, and there was nothing unusual about the sounds. But that night, everything changed. Around dusk, I saw it. A figure, tall, moving slowly at the edge of the clearing. It was partially hidden behind a tree. I froze. It didn't move like an animal, too upright, too deliberate. I ducked behind the cabin briefly, trying to see if I was imagining it. But it was still there, watching, its movements measured, patient. I grabbed a large stick, thinking if it came closer, I would need to defend myself. I tried to make noise, banging on the cabin walls and shouting, but the figure didn't react. It stayed in the shadows, watching. I spent hours that night in the loft, fully awake, the stick in my hand. The figure didn't leave. At times, I thought it might be a local, someone familiar with the area. But there were no lights, no sounds of tools, no signs that it had been preparing anything. Just waiting. I watched through a small gap in the window, unable to tear my eyes away. Every sound, the snap of a branch, the rustle of leaves, made my heart race. I kept thinking about every horror story I had ever heard about isolated cabins. I reminded myself to remain calm, to wait for daylight. But sleep was impossible. By morning, I realized the figure had gone, leaving only faint footprints partially obscured by dew. I packed quickly, not waiting for breakfast or fire. I needed to leave, but when I tried the car, I found the tires partially deflated. punctured. My pulse spiked. I was trapped, in a sense. I grabbed my spare, changed the tires, and kept looking around. I thought I saw movement in the distance, but I wasn't sure. Once the car was ready, I decided to drive slowly, watching for any signs of the figure. The drive back was tense. Every bend in the road, every shadow made me alert. The forest seemed to follow me, dense and silent, but no one appeared. When I finally reached the main road, with cell signal strong enough to call for help, I felt a rush of relief. I explained to the local authorities what had happened, and they checked the area. They found no trace of anyone lingering near the cabin, only the deep scratches on the trees and evidence that someone had tampered with the tires. They warned me that the area could attract dangerous people, but said it was rare. I never returned to that cabin. The experience stayed with me for months, haunting me in ways I couldn't explain. The sense of being watched, the careful patience of whoever had been there. It was something primal, something that lodged in my mind. I couldn't rationalize it completely. I stayed away from isolated places after that, always taking someone with me if I ventured into the woods. I learned that nature itself isn't dangerous, but humans, even unseen and silent, can be the most frightening presence of all. Eventually, the memory faded enough that I could speak about it without feeling the panic. I shared the story with a few close friends, emphasizing the lessons rather than the terror. But every time I think about that cabin, about the dark forest and the quiet figure at the edge of the clearing, I can still feel the weight of those hours, the silence that was not empty, the understanding that sometimes real fear doesn't come from myths or shadows. It comes from the unpredictable intentions of another human being. The ending was clear in its own way. I survived. I escaped. I took precautions. I learned to respect isolation and to never underestimate the presence of others in remote spaces. The memory remained, but it no longer controlled me. I had been planning the trip for months, a solo getaway in a remote cabin far from any sign of civilization. The idea was simple: escape the constant noise of the city, the unending stream of people, traffic, and deadlines, and just be alone with nature for a while. I thought I knew what solitude felt like, but I had never been alone in a place that was truly, completely isolated. The cabin itself was small, built decades ago by someone who wanted to live off the grid. It had a wood-burning stove, a tiny kitchen, a lofted bedroom, and a single bathroom. There was no electricity, no running water beyond a small pump fed by a nearby creek, and no cell service. The directions to get there had been straightforward enough on paper, but when I drove the last 10 miles on a dirt track that twisted through dense pine forests, the isolation became tangible. Every turn seemed to carry me deeper into silence, and I realized there would be no one for miles, no one to call if something went wrong. The first night was unnerving, though I told myself it was just nerves. The sounds of the forest were different at night than in the day. I could hear branches snapping somewhere far off, leaves rustling, the occasional bird, and a constant undercurrent of wind through the pines. Shadows moved across the walls as the moonlight spilled in through the windows. My first instinct was to check the locks, even though the cabin had nothing but a basic deadbolt and a simple latch. I felt exposed in a way I had never before, but it was a good kind of fear at first, a sharp alertness that made me feel alive. I made a fire in the stove, stacked it high with the wood I had brought in from outside, and settled into a chair with a cup of instant coffee. I looked around, absorbing the small space, the rough wood walls, the musty smell that told me this place had been untouched for years. Felt like stepping into a time capsule. The next day, I explored the surroundings. There was a trail that led down to the creek and a small clearing nearby where someone had once tried to grow a garden, long since overrun with weeds. I found an old fire pit, its stones blackened from decades of use, and stacked more firewood near the cabin. I took in every detail: the way the sun hit the trees in the morning, the sound of water rushing over rocks in the creek, the smell of damp earth. I felt completely alone, and for the first time in years, I did not feel the need to check my phone. I imagined staying here for weeks, reading, writing, just living with the rhythm of the forest. That afternoon, though, something subtle shifted. It started with small things that I could almost convince myself were coincidences. I had leaned my backpack against the wall, and when I returned from chopping more wood, it had been moved a few feet. I told myself the floor might be uneven, and it had just slid. Later, I noticed that some of the kindling I had stacked by the stove was in a different order. I chalked it up to my memory failing me. Then I heard noises outside. Footsteps on the dirt path leading to the cabin, faint at first, and then closer. My first instinct was to tell myself it was an animal, maybe a deer or a raccoon, but the cadence felt off. Too deliberate, too heavy. I grabbed the small hunting knife I had brought along, my hand shaking slightly. I stared out the window, scanning the tree line, but saw nothing. No movement, no shadow, nothing to explain the sound. That night, I slept fitfully. Every sound was amplified, every creak of the old cabin boards echoing in my mind. When I woke up, I found the back door slightly ajar. I was certain I had locked it the night before. My stomach sank. I checked the cabin thoroughly, every corner, every window. Nothing was missing. Nothing seemed out of place beyond the door. I tried to rationalize. Maybe the latch hadn't caught properly. Maybe the wind had pushed it open. But even as I convinced myself of that, a thread of unease ran through me, tightening with each passing hour. The following day, I decided to go further into the woods, to explore deeper trails that were barely marked. I carried a small backpack with water, food, a compass, and a flashlight. The forest was dense, the trees tall and closely spaced. The sunlight barely pierced the canopy. As I walked, I kept hearing that same faint sound, the snap of branches, like someone was following at a distance. I would stop, listen, but the forest remained still. I tried to focus on the birds, on the small streams, on the smell of pine and moss. I was careful not to panic, reminding myself that it was probably just my imagination. But the feeling of being watched was relentless. When I returned to the cabin in the evening, I noticed something else. My firewood, stacked neatly the day before, was now scattered. It was not merely rearranged, but tipped over, some pieces broken. My heart pounded. I double-checked every lock, reinforced the doors as best I could, and stayed near the stove, making a larger fire than usual. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been here while I was gone. The rational part of me argued that the cabin was too isolated, and no one could have found me in the forest so quickly. But the other part, the primal, anxious part, whispered that I wasn't imagining it. I wasn't alone. Over the next 2 days, I stayed inside almost entirely, venturing out only for essential supplies and to fetch water from the creek. Each time I returned, the cabin bore signs that someone had been there. A window slightly open, a chair shifted, food rearranged in the kitchen. I stopped trying to rationalize. My mind felt tense, alert, and almost paranoid. Every shadow, every small noise made my heart race. I slept very little, only drifting off in short bursts, waking at the slightest sound. I kept thinking about what I would do if someone tried to get inside. I had the knife, yes, but I also knew I would be at a disadvantage if there were more than one person. The forest offered no easy escape. I was trapped in a place I had thought was a sanctuary. On the 4th night, it became worse. I had gone to bed early, exhausted from the constant vigilance, when I heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps on the porch. Slow, deliberate circling. My breath caught, and I clutched the knife so tightly my knuckles hurt. I stayed perfectly still, listening. The sound moved away, then returned. I realized it wasn't outside anymore. It was inside. Someone had managed to get in. My heart raced as I thought of the layout. There was only one entrance, the back door, which I had locked. The windows were old, but I hadn't seen any signs of tampering. Whoever it was, they had found a way in. I did the only thing I could think of. I crawled to the loft where my bed was, trying to make as little noise as possible. I held the knife against my chest, breathing shallowly, listening to the soft scraping sounds below. Hours passed. I could hear someone moving around, opening drawers, rifling through things. I told myself to stay calm, to make no noise, but every nerve was on edge, screaming at me to run, to fight, to escape. Finally, The footsteps receded, and silence returned. I waited until morning, still in the loft, every muscle tensed. When I finally emerged, I found the cabin in disarray. The stove had been opened, my backpack rummaged through, some of my food missing. But there were no signs of the intruder. They had vanished as silently as they had come. I realized then that I had two choices: stay and risk another encounter, or leave and never return. I decided to leave. I packed quickly, keeping the knife in my hand, and stepped out into the cold morning. The forest seemed different now, oppressive rather than beautiful. Every shadow, every sound was amplified by fear. I didn't take the trail back to the road. I struck out through the undergrowth, aiming for a ridge I had spotted earlier. The climb was exhausting. I scratched my arms on branches and slipped in the mud, but I kept moving, knowing that if I stopped, I would let fear take over. By late afternoon, I emerged onto a small dirt road. My car was parked several miles back, so I walked until I found a cell tower with enough signal to call for help. A local ranger came out that evening after I explained everything. They scoured the area but found no trace of anyone. No footprints, no evidence beyond the cabin's disarray. I never went back. I sold the cabin a few months later. I still think about it. The way the forest pressed against the windows, the feeling of being watched, the small signs that someone had been there before me. I learned that isolation can be terrifying, even when you think you are prepared. You can be careful, you can take precautions, but there are always unknown variables. People, terrain, circumstances that can turn a dream getaway into a nightmare. Since then, I have been cautious about remote trips. I still love the forest, still crave solitude, but I make sure I am never completely alone in such isolated places. I check and recheck every lock, carry more protection, and always have a plan to leave quickly. That cabin, that forest, taught me about vigilance, about the thin line between safety and danger, and about the way fear can sharpen every sense. I never thought a simple weekend getaway could turn into one of the most frightening experiences of my life. I had planned the trip months in advance. My goal was simple: escape the noise of the city, the constant hum of traffic, the unending chain of work emails, and the suffocating sense of obligation that always seemed to follow me. I wanted to get away, to a quiet place in the woods, where I could breathe, think, and just exist for a while without anyone demanding anything of me. I found the cabin online. It was isolated, in the middle of a forest, near a lake that was supposed to be beautiful and pristine. The pictures made it look perfect: wooden, rustic, with a stone fireplace, a small porch, and windows that looked out over the trees. Everything about it promised solitude and peace. I ignored the feeling in the pit of my stomach that whispered, maybe too many too good to be true things end badly. I left Friday morning. The drive took longer than expected, winding through narrow, twisting roads that were overgrown in places, the asphalt cracked and littered with fallen leaves and pine needles. I passed only a handful of cars. Each time another vehicle appeared, it felt like a small confirmation that I was still connected to the world. But those moments were fleeting. Most of the drive was silent, save for the hum of my tires over the rough patches of road. I noticed that the farther I went, the fewer signs of human life appeared. No houses, no small farms, no stray dogs. Just forest, thick and looming, and the occasional abandoned building that had clearly once been something else. By the time I arrived, the sun was already sinking behind the trees. The cabin was exactly as pictured: a small wooden structure with dark shingles and a chimney that had seen years of rain. I parked my car beside it, the gravel crunching under my tires, and stepped out into the cool air. The smell hit me first, the sharp scent of wet pine and soil. The quiet was almost too heavy, pressing against my ears. I carried my bags inside and started to explore. The cabin was simple, with a living area, a small kitchen, a single bathroom, and a bedroom. It smelled faintly of old wood and something else, dampness perhaps from being closed up for a while. I unpacked quickly, determined to make myself at home. I stacked my clothes, laid out some supplies, and began organizing food in the kitchen. The sun disappeared entirely while I was busy, and when I looked out the windows, everything outside had become a shadowy blur. The trees were black silhouettes against the fading sky. I lit a fire in the stone fireplace. The crackling of the wood was comforting, filling the room with warmth and a sense of temporary safety. Outside, the wind rustled the trees, and I realized I could no longer see the path that had brought me here. The forest felt infinite. That first night, I slept restlessly. Every sound seemed amplified. When a branch scraped against the cabin wall, my heart jumped. When I heard a distant thump, I froze, straining my ears to figure out if it was a deer, a falling branch, or something else. I reminded myself constantly that the forest was alive, that this was normal. Still, I couldn't shake the sense that I was being watched. I had never felt so alone, and the darkness outside the windows felt almost alive, shifting with each gust of wind. The next morning, I decided to explore the area around the cabin. I wanted to make sure I knew the terrain in case of any emergencies. The path to the lake was not difficult, but it was narrow, covered with fallen leaves and twigs that crunched underfoot. The forest was dense, the trees towering overhead, branches tangled like a web. Birds chirped occasionally, but there was no other sign of human life. I reached the lake mid-morning. It was beautiful, just as promised, clear water reflecting the sky, but the stillness was unsettling. The silence pressed down on me. I could see the ripples of fish beneath the surface, but no movement beyond that. I sat on a rock for a while, trying to calm myself. The isolation was both thrilling and unnerving. By afternoon, I returned to the cabin. I spent the next few hours organizing supplies and checking equipment. I had brought a small first aid kit, extra food, water, a flashlight, a radio, and a few other essentials. I felt safe, prepared even, but the feeling didn't last. As evening approached, the wind picked up and the trees began to groan. I lit another fire and tried to focus on mundane tasks, washing dishes, stacking firewood, but the feeling of unease persisted. Then I heard it, a sound so subtle at first that I questioned whether I imagined it. It was a soft crunch, like footsteps on gravel. My cabin sat on a small clearing, surrounded by thick forest, and there was no road leading directly to it except the narrow path I had taken. I froze, listening. The steps continued, slow, deliberate, and moving closer. I told myself it must be an animal, maybe a deer, maybe a raccoon, but the rhythm of the steps didn't match any animal I knew. Animals scurry, they dart. These steps were measured, human. I grabbed my flashlight and cautiously peeked out the window. The beam cut through the darkness, revealing nothing but trees. Still, the sound of the steps moved along the perimeter of the cabin. I realized with growing dread that whoever or whatever was out there knew exactly where the cabin was. Panic rose in my chest, but I forced myself to stay calm. I locked the doors, checked the windows, and made sure the fire was strong. I sat near it, holding the flashlight and staring at the shadows outside. The steps stopped. Hours passed. The forest fell silent again, except for the wind. I waited until dawn, eyes fixed on the windows. When the first light appeared, I went outside, cautiously inspecting the perimeter. There were footprints in the mud, human footprints circling the cabin. My stomach dropped. Someone had been there, had walked around my cabin during the night. The footprints led off into the woods and vanished. My mind raced, imagining all the possible scenarios. I considered calling for help, but my phone signal was weak, barely enough to send a text, let alone make a call. I decided I couldn't stay inside. I needed to get to a place with more people. I packed my bags quickly, stuffing clothes and supplies into my backpack. I left the cabin in a hurry, but I made sure to take a few precautions. I kept the fire going to make it appear I hadn't left in panic, and I moved quietly, scanning the forest constantly. Every rustle made my heart race. The path was narrow, and I had to be careful not to trip. I tried to remember every turn, every landmark, so I wouldn't get lost. As I walked, I noticed more signs that someone had been nearby. Broken branches, footprints crossing mine, flattened grass. Whoever had been circling the cabin had been watching me. The fear of being followed was almost unbearable. I increased my pace, but the forest seemed endless. Hours passed, and the sun climbed higher, casting shadows that shifted and played tricks on my eyes. I stopped occasionally to catch my breath, constantly scanning the trees for movement. Eventually, I reached a dirt road, wider than the path to the cabin. Relief washed over me. I followed it, hoping it would lead to a small town or at least a place with a phone signal. Hours later, I found a rural gas station, a tiny place with one attendant and a few cars. I explained my situation, and he immediately called the police for me. They listened carefully, taking notes, and promised to check the area around the cabin. I stayed there until they arrived, exhausted, shaking, and unable to believe what had happened. When the police reached the cabin, they found clear signs that someone had been living in the area for a while. Makeshift shelters, discarded items, footprints, and even remnants of food. They confirmed that this person had likely been watching the cabin for weeks, waiting for someone to arrive. The idea of someone lurking in the forest, so close yet invisible, was terrifying. I realized how lucky I had been to leave when I did. In the following days, I stayed with friends in town, sleeping lightly, always looking over my shoulder. I returned once more to collect my remaining belongings, accompanied by 2 officers. The cabin felt different, haunted not by ghosts but by the knowledge of someone real, someone who had been stalking me. I took only what I could carry and left the place behind, never to return. The experience stayed with me. I couldn't stop thinking about how easily things could have gone wrong, how fragile our sense of safety really is. I learned to respect isolation, to be cautious, and to trust that gut instinct that whispers warnings we often ignore. And while I returned to my life, I never again sought solitude in the wild without careful preparation, awareness, and a plan for escape. The forest had taught me a lesson I would never forget. The world can be quiet, beautiful, and safe, or it can be silent, deceptive, and dangerously close to someone watching your every move. It started as a trip I thought would be simple. I wanted to get away from the city for a week, escape the constant noise, the endless traffic, the lights that never went out. I had found a cabin online, small and secluded, tucked away in a dense forest 3 hours from the nearest town. The pictures made it look peaceful, quiet, perfect for writing, reading, and just being alone with my thoughts. I didn't know that solitude, when it's absolute and unbroken, can become something entirely different. I arrived in the late afternoon. The drive up was long, and the road narrowed sharply, twisting between steep hills and thick groves of trees. There were no streetlights, no signs of other vehicles, and the silence, once I turned off the engine, was so profound it almost made my ears ache. The cabin itself was small, a single story with a stone chimney and weathered wooden walls that looked like they had been standing for decades. I parked in the gravel clearing in front of it and took a long, deep breath, feeling the forest around me, the weight of it pressing in from all sides. I had my backpack with food, a lantern, a flashlight, and a small first aid kit, all carefully packed for this trip. Inside, the cabin smelled of dust and old wood. There were 2 small bedrooms, a kitchen with a gas stove, a table in the middle of the living room, and a small bathroom. Everything was functional but sparse. I unpacked slowly, arranging my things, trying to shake off the unease that had settled in my stomach as I walked inside. Something about the stillness of the forest, the way the trees leaned close to the cabin, made the walls feel tighter than they should. I spent the first few hours exploring. The forest behind the cabin was dense, with ferns and low shrubs that made the ground soft underfoot. There was a small stream not far from the back of the cabin. I could hear the water trickling over stones, the sound soothing, but also strangely lonely, like the forest was holding its breath. The sun began to set, turning the sky a deep orange that faded to dark blue as I walked back to the cabin. By the time I got inside, the darkness had swallowed the forest, and only the light from my lantern kept the shadows from creeping too close. That night, I slept fitfully. Every small noise, the creak of the cabin settling, the rustle of branches outside, The distant crack of a falling limb woke me. I kept thinking I saw movement through the thin curtains, shapes that looked like people or animals, but when I looked again, there was nothing. I told myself it was my imagination, that I had been cooped up in the city too long, that the forest played tricks on the eyes. The next day, I decided to explore further. I followed a narrow path that led deeper into the forest. The trees grew closer together, their trunks thick and gnarled, their branches forming a canopy that dimmed the sunlight even at midday. Birds called occasionally, but it was quieter than I had expected. There were no signs of other people, no trails, no litter, no sounds of cars or voices. Just me, the forest, and the soft crunch of leaves under my boots. I came across an old fire pit with charred stones, a few pieces of rusty metal, and signs that someone had been here long ago, but I couldn't tell when. There was no cabin nearby, no path, no way to know who had been here. As the hours passed, I realized I had walked farther than I had intended. The path had narrowed into something almost like a game trail, barely wide enough for one person. The forest seemed to press in on all sides, and I started to feel a tension I couldn't explain. My instincts screamed to turn back, but I kept going, telling myself I could retrace my steps, that I wasn't really lost. But the deeper I went, the more uniform the trees looked, the less I recognized anything. Every tree seemed like a twin of the one beside it. Every bend in the trail looked the same. I began marking the trees with small scratches on the bark so I could find my way back. Hours later, the sun began to fall, and the shadows grew long. I realized I had no idea where I was. The path had disappeared completely, and I was in an area where the trees were too thick to see more than a few feet in any direction. Panic began to creep in. My stomach tightened. My hands shook slightly as I checked my watch, then the compass I had brought, then the map. None of it made sense. I couldn't recognize any landmarks. The map showed paths, but nothing matched what I was seeing. I tried to retrace my steps, but the forest seemed to have shifted. Branches and fallen logs blocked paths I was certain I had taken. Night came quickly. I hadn't brought enough water to last a full day out here, and I realized I hadn't eaten since morning. My flashlight illuminated only small patches of the forest ahead. Every sound was amplified in the dark. The snap of a branch, the rustle of leaves, the distant call of some animal. My mind started playing tricks on me, making me think I heard voices, footsteps, or someone moving in the shadows. I told myself I was alone, but the isolation was suffocating. I decided to move slowly, staying low and careful, trying to find any sign of the cabin. I thought about climbing a tree to get a view, but the thick branches and dense leaves made it impossible. My flashlight's batteries were starting to dim, and I realized I had no way of signaling for help. My phone had no signal. My pulse raced as I considered the reality. I was alone, lost in a forest that seemed to have no paths, with night pressing down all around me. Hours passed. I stumbled over roots and rocks, scraped my hands on branches, and felt exhaustion setting in. I began to hear animals more clearly now, larger ones moving through the underbrush, breaking branches, moving with a weight that suggested something bigger than deer or foxes. Fear gripped me like a vice. I realized how unprepared I had been. The forest, which had seemed peaceful from the cabin, now felt like a maze designed to trap me. I had nothing but the clothes on my back, my small backpack, and the faint hope that I could find my way out. At some point, I realized I was not just tired but on the edge of collapse. My legs ached. My hands were cut and bleeding from branches. My mouth was dry. I considered sitting down and waiting for daylight, but I knew that if I stayed still, I might not have the strength to get up again. I forced myself to keep moving, staying close to any signs of human presence. Old trees with marks, rusted bits of metal, anything that could suggest a trail. Around midnight, I stumbled into a clearing. It was small, surrounded by thick trees, but in the center was something that made my heart leap, a faint glimmer of light. I ran toward it, tripping over roots, crawling under branches, desperate. As I approached, I realized it was a fire. Someone had built a small, controlled fire, and the smoke curled up into the sky. I crouched behind a tree, watching, There was movement, a figure sitting near the fire. I couldn't see clearly, but the presence of another human gave me a rush of hope and fear. I debated for what felt like hours. Approaching could be dangerous. I had no idea who this person was or why they were out here in the middle of nowhere. But I knew I had to do something. Hunger, exhaustion, and fear were crushing me. Slowly, I stepped out from behind the tree, trying to make my presence known. The person looked up, startled but not threatening. I raised my hands to show I meant no harm. They nodded, then pointed toward a narrow trail leading out of the clearing. I followed, almost falling over my own feet, relief washing over me with every step. The trail led me back to a faint dirt road. I recognized it as the same one I had driven on to reach the cabin. I ran, stumbling over loose rocks, until I saw the familiar gravel clearing, the cabin silhouetted against the first hints of dawn. I collapsed at the door, my body shaking, my legs too weak to stand, but safe. The next hours were slow. I drank water, ate some of the food I had packed, and tended to my cuts. I thought about what had happened, the fear, the isolation, the realization of just how fragile my control over my environment could be. I understood, in a deep, bone-deep way, that the forest had not been threatening on purpose, but it was indifferent. It would not care if I was lost or injured. That night, I had learned the power of absolute isolation and the importance of preparation, awareness, and respect for nature. By mid-morning, I felt strong enough to start packing. I would leave, but I knew I would carry this experience with me forever. I checked the cabin carefully, ensuring everything was in order. The forest looked peaceful in daylight, almost inviting, but I knew the truth. I had survived because I had found the fire, because I had made the right decisions when it mattered, because I had pushed myself beyond exhaustion. That knowledge was sobering. As I drove away, the forest receding behind me, I felt a mix of relief and awe. I had gone seeking solitude and beauty, and I had found it, but only after confronting fear, uncertainty, and the limits of my own endurance. The cabin was quiet, the trees dense and unyielding. I had been planning the trip for months. The cabin was somewhere deep in the woods, far away from roads, towns, and the sound of anything resembling civilization. I had rented it online after combing through dozens of listings. The pictures had shown a small, rustic cabin tucked between tall pines and oaks, with a creek running nearby and a small clearing around it. The thought of being alone, away from people, away from traffic, and the constant hum of electronics was exhilarating. I needed a break from the constant noise of life, from work emails, from city stress. I wanted silence, nature, and isolation, but I wanted it on my terms, with some control over the situation. I never expected what came next. The drive had taken longer than I anticipated. GPS signal was patchy, and roads that looked on the map like solid highways turned out to be gravel paths, overgrown in places with low-hanging branches scraping the top of my car. I had a small SUV, something that handled rough terrain reasonably well. But even then, I had to maneuver slowly, carefully, watching for rocks, holes, and exposed roots. The sun was low in the sky when I finally arrived at the clearing. The cabin looked exactly like the pictures, but there was something about the way it sat there that made it feel oddly out of place, like it had been built long ago and forgotten, waiting for someone to stumble upon it. The wood of the cabin was weathered, gray with age, and the windows were dusty. I could see the chimney leaned slightly, and the porch boards had gaps that had formed over years. I parked the car near the cabin and stepped out. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of pine and damp earth. Birds called intermittently, and a few squirrels darted across the ground, startled by my presence. I carried my bag and a box of supplies into the cabin, grateful that it seemed structurally sound. Inside, it was small but functional. A kitchen area with a sink and stove, a table, a few chairs, a small living space with a couch and a wood-burning stove, and a loft with a mattress. There was no electricity except for a few battery-powered lights and a generator that the listing said worked if needed. There was a small supply of firewood stacked near the stove, and I immediately set about checking everything, testing doors, windows, and locks. The first night was uneventful. I had dinner, lit the stove, and sat near the fire, watching the flames and listening to the night sounds outside. Owls called, the creek bubbled nearby, and the wind moved through the trees in slow, rhythmic sweeps. I felt a calmness that I had not felt in months. Around midnight, I went to bed. The mattress was hard, but I was too tired to care. I slept deeply. The next morning, I woke early to sunlight spilling through the window. The cabin was peaceful, and I decided to explore the surrounding area. The clearing was small, and beyond it, the forest was dense. I found a trail that led deeper into the woods, winding along the creek, and I decided to follow it. The forest floor was soft with pine needles, and every so often, I would step on a hidden root and stumble slightly. Birds were more active in the morning, and I saw a deer drinking at a small pond a few hundred meters down the trail. I felt alive, connected to the environment, and unbothered by the isolation. I returned to the cabin around midday and prepared lunch. I had brought canned goods, bread, some fresh vegetables, and eggs. Cooking on the small stove was straightforward, and I ate slowly, enjoying the silence. After lunch, I decided to read by the window, watching sunlight flicker across the trees. Around mid-afternoon, a sound outside caught my attention. It was faint at first, like a scraping noise, almost metallic. I stepped outside to look but saw nothing. The wind carried the sound away, and I dismissed it as a branch rubbing against the cabin or something else natural. The evening arrived, and I lit the stove again. This time, I noticed that the silence felt heavier. The noises of the forest seemed louder because there was nothing else. That's when I heard it clearly. A crack, like a branch snapping, followed by a shuffle. I froze. The sound came from the side of the cabin, where the trees were thick. My first thought was an animal, maybe a deer or a raccoon, but the shuffle sounded deliberate, closer, and heavier. I went to the window and peered into the darkness. Nothing moved, but I could hear breathing, heavy, measured, and very close. I grabbed a flashlight and stepped onto the porch. The beam cut through the dark, illuminating the trees and the edge of the clearing, but no one was there. The hair on my neck stood up, and my pulse quickened. I told myself it was an animal, maybe a bear or a large dog from a nearby property. I had read that black bears sometimes wander through forested areas, but the sound didn't fit. It was too careful, too methodical. I went inside and locked the door, checking all windows again. I stacked a chair against the main door for extra security. I didn't sleep much that night. Every time the wind blew or a branch fell, I jumped. I kept my phone charged, although there was no signal, and I kept the flashlight within reach. I thought about the next day, about how I could cut my stay short, but something stubborn inside me wanted to see it through. I didn't want to leave the cabin feeling like I had run away. The following day, I tried to act normal. I went for a long hike along the creek, took photographs of the scenery, and collected small stones and leaves. But I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every so often, I would catch movement in the corner of my eye, shadows among the trees, a flash of reflective eyes. I told myself I was imagining it. Still, I started carrying a heavy hiking stick whenever I ventured outside. That afternoon, I returned to the cabin and noticed something that made my stomach twist. The back door, which I had locked tightly the night before, was slightly ajar. I knew I had locked it. I checked the locks again. They had not been tampered with, yet the door had moved. I inspected the surrounding ground. There were faint footprints in the soft earth, human, small, maybe from someone wearing sneakers. My heart pounded. Whoever had been here had been careful enough to not leave much behind, but careless enough to leave these tracks. I spent the next hours fortifying the cabin. I moved furniture to block doors, placed heavy objects near windows, and even made a small weapon from a metal rod I found in the shed. I stayed near the stove, fire burning, listening. Around dusk, the forest grew darker than usual, thick shadows stretching across the clearing. I could hear the occasional snap of twigs, distant but deliberate. I felt trapped, isolated, and vulnerable in a way that I had never felt before. That night, the sounds outside were relentless. Footsteps circled the cabin, stopping and starting at irregular intervals. Leaves rustled. I could hear whispers of movement, the occasional sound of something sliding across the ground. I didn't open the door. I didn't look out the windows except through small gaps. Sleep was impossible. I sat near the stove, trying to remain calm, counting the minutes, imagining scenarios in my head. The next morning, I decided to leave. I packed quickly, not daring to linger, and loaded my car. As I backed out of the clearing, I noticed something that made me catch my breath. There were more footprints, deeper, larger, surrounding the cabin, leading into the woods and disappearing from view. Someone or multiple people had been there watching, waiting. My stomach churned with fear, but I focused on driving. The rough road stretched for miles, and only when I reached the main highway did I allow myself to breathe freely. Even then, I couldn't shake the feeling of eyes on me. I called the local authorities when I got back to town. They took my statement seriously but explained that these woods were isolated, and trespassers sometimes targeted cabins for burglary or worse. They promised to send a patrol next time they were in the area. I reported the cabin rental as well, warning that someone had likely been lurking around. Over the next few weeks, I returned to normal life, but the memory of the cabin stayed with me. I replayed each sound, each shadow, each footprint in my mind, analyzing what could have happened, what I might have missed, what danger I had narrowly avoided. I never went back to that area. I bought a property in a more populated rural region for future trips, where help was closer and isolation was safer. The experience changed the way I approached solitude. I still wanted nature, peace, and quiet, but I understood now that true isolation carried risks that no amount of planning could eliminate completely. I learned to respect the woods, the people who might be out there, and the vulnerability that comes with being alone. Looking back, I realized I was lucky, extremely lucky. There was no supernatural presence, no fantasy horror lurking in the trees. There was only a human threat, silent and patient, observing without revealing itself. I left that cabin alive, but the weight of the unknown stayed with me. I never underestimate the danger of isolation again, and I never ignore the signs that someone or something could be watching. I still return to the forest, but I do so with caution.